On November 11th, 2011, Bethesda Game Studios released one of the best-selling RPGs of all time, The Elder Scrolls V: Skyrim. The fifth game in the Elder Scrolls franchise, as I'm sure you already know, and even if you didn't already know that, if you didn't figure that out from the title, then I feel sorry for you. This game proved to be not only a hit, but a bona fide phenomenon. Not only did this game sell like hotcakes, and continues to sell like hotcakes even to this day, but it revolutionized the way RPGs were seen and developed from that point on. Today, I wish to take an extensive, exhaustive look back at this game, and see if this 2011 gem holds up by today's standards. As you can probably tell from this video's length, this is going to be the most extensive analysis I have done on a game up to this point. If you're new to my channel, I hope you agree to stay. First, my background on the subject. I am a huge fan of the Elder Scrolls. When I was 16, I got my first part-time job at Sonic Drive-In. I saved my first 2 paychecks and purchased an Xbox 360 and a copy of the Elder Scrolls IV: Oblivion. I've been hooked on the franchise ever since. I was sucked in almost on day 1 by the incredible stealth gameplay that Oblivion offered, the massive world that I could explore to my heart's content, and the extensive lore that the franchise boasted. Needless to say, when Skyrim came out, I got myself a copy. To say that I loved that game was an understatement. If the video were just a question of whether Skyrim was a good game for its time, then the video is done. The answer to that question is undoubtedly yes. But I would like to know if it is still a great game by 2019 standards. There have been plenty of great RPGs to come out since then, including but not limited to Dark Souls and The Witcher 3: Wild Hunt. Skyrim has quite a lot of competition now. Does it still hold up despite the competition? This retrospective will contain massive spoilers for Skyrim's main quest, faction quest lines, DLCs, and even a few side quests. I feel like anyone who's interested in a video like this will have already played this game, but I just want to get the formalities out of the way at the outset. Last but not least, before we get to the retrospective proper, I have a minor favor to ask of you. I want you all to post your comments and tell me your thoughts. Not only do I enjoy deep, intellectual, and thought-provoking discussion, it also helps me to discover new topics to make videos about. By all means, feel free to even disagree with my opinions in this video, as long as you're civil about it. After all, it is fairly well documented that exposing oneself to different points of view than what you're used to is a scientifically proven method of coming up with new ideas whenever you're in a field that requires creativity, such as YouTube content creation. So even if you can't think of anything to say, be sure to say something. Be sure to comment, comment, comment. So with that out of the way, let's get this party started. The game starts out with an exposition dump. It's not very action-packed, but don't worry, the action will be coming shortly. The opening cutscene provides exposition which is necessary for setting the stage. The game is an epic. It doesn't just take its time to get underway. Nearly every line of this opening cutscene conveys some important information. First, there's a guy named Lokir who provides us with the exposition that some people oppose the Stormcloak Rebellion not because they disapprove of the Stormcloak's ideals, but because the Stormcloak Rebellion is indirectly causing the very problem it supposedly seeks to rectify by forcing Imperial occupation of Skyrim in the first place. Ralof has his finest character moment in this cutscene. He flat out tells everyone in the cart that they're being hauled off to be summarily executed, and yet he constantly has a smile on his face. This man is about to die, and he couldn't be happier about it. He knew the risk when he enlisted with the Stormcloaks. He and the rest of his Stormcloak brethren gave it everything they had, and they're proud of the resistance they put up. Of course, death to him is the lesser of two evils compared to a life without Talos worship, so since he believes they've lost the war, he would rather be executed than forced to abandon Talos. At the very least, maybe his and Ulfric's deaths will become martyrs for their causes. As we step off the cart, we get a lot more story when the names are being called off the lists. The player character is not on the list of people to be executed, but Lokir is. Lokir is not affiliated with the rebels though, so why is his name on the list? The only thing he's supposedly wanted for is horse thievery, and yet he's still going to be executed for that. While most people often point to the way the Legion sends the player character to his death as a prime example of the Empire showing their true colors, this moment, in my opinion, is equally as telling. The Empire is so fed up with dealing with Skyrim that they'll just impose summary execution to anyone who's even a minor nuisance to them, even if they're only wanted for horse thievery. God, these people are dicks! Next, we have the moment that everyone points to as a shining example of why the Empire deserves to be rebelled against. Hadvar says point blank that you're not on the list of wanted men, but his commanding officer doesn't care. She orders you to the chopping block regardless. These Legionnaires are so tired from dealing with the Stormcloaks that they can't even be bothered to spare the life of a clearly innocent person if it hinders their agenda for even a minute. God, these people are dicks. Hadvar may be a bit nicer to you than the rest of the Legionnaires at the moment, but he is still clearly part of the problem. In only 4 short words, by your orders, Captain, Hadvar instantly personifies the core problem that the Stormcloaks are fighting against: complacency. Yes, Talos worship is a major rallying point for their cause, but the ban on Talos worship is only one part of a much larger problem that the Stormcloaks see with the Empire. The Empire's citizens' tendency to turn a blind eye to the Empire committing horrible atrocities, as well as the Empire itself being practically a vassal state to the Aldmeri Dominion. The Stormcloaks see the Empire and Dominion as mere bullies, and you know what you do with bullies: you stand up to them. So we are taken to the chopping block, and the Stormcloaks are given their last rites. There's actually a very subtle moment in this set piece that a lot of you probably didn't notice.
As we commend your souls to Aetherius, blessings of the 8 divines upon you.
For the love of Talos, shut up and let's get this over.
Learn.
It sounds like this guy is just anxious to become a martyr and to show the Empire that he has no fear, just like Ralof. But pay attention carefully to what happens just before he does this. The priest says, blessings of the 8 divines, not the 9 divines. As we all know, Talos was banned from the official Imperial Pantheon as part of the White Gold Concordat. In other words, the Stormcloaks are being given the blessings of every god except the one they worship. After his death, the captain calls for the player character. Some have argued that she should have just executed Ulfric Stormcloak right then and there, but I honestly see what the Empire was going for. They didn't expect Ulfric would be able to escape. How were they supposed to know a dragon was about to attack? They wanted to save Ulfric for last, so he could watch his beloved Stormcloak soldiers be picked off one by one until he eventually joined them. They were dragging out Ulfric's suffering just to psychologically torment him before killing him. So in addition to being colossal dicks, they are also psychopaths who enjoy torturing their captives, more or less for its own sake, a trait we see inside Helgen Keep when we see that they keep torture chambers in their keeps. Hell, in the real world, when the Roman Empire used crucifixion as their standard method of execution, at least it wasn't primarily for their own sadistic pleasure. It was an intentionally long and agonizing death, but that's because the threat of such a gruesome death was meant to serve as a deterrent to other criminals, not simply a means of getting your psychopath jollies off. That's why the crucifixions took place in a public location. Here, the executions are happening in a public road, sure, but there's no reason not to take out the leader of the rebellion as soon as possible. That much is being done exclusively for their own sadistic ends, not any legitimate law enforcement purpose. So the player character walks up to the chopping block and a dragon attacks. We get another really great character moment from Ralof here. Instead of running for cover, he actually stays behind just long enough to make sure you're able to get to your feet. He didn't have to do that. It just goes to show how much of a hero Ralof is. Sure, Hadvar displays some heroics during this set piece as he is seen rescuing children, but Ralof also being heroic just goes to show that the Stormcloaks aren't simply villains who only want power for its own sake. So we work our way through a series of chaotic set pieces and eventually make our way to the Helgen Keep. We have to choose Hadvar or Ralof to accompany through the keep. However, whereas before I praised how the cutscenes and dialogue up to this point highlighted the differences between the two factions, here I have to complain that the two options are not similar enough. Bear in mind that this is the tutorial quest for this game. On a first time playthrough, this is your chance to get used to whatever playstyle you prefer. This means you need to be exposed to a wide variety of playstyles during the tutorial. While they certainly expose the player to lockpicking, spellcasting, and at the end, sneaking, they don't offer a wide enough variety of weapons and armor. They have a full range of weapons and armor in the tutorial, but you have to accompany both Hadvar and Ralof to be exposed to them all. If you go with Ralof, you cannot obtain any two-handed weapons. If you go with Hadvar, you cannot obtain a full suit of heavy armor. Only on multiple playthroughs are you able to experience everything. While I normally approve of requiring multiple playthroughs to see everything a game has to offer, I do not approve of this tactic in the tutorial dungeon. The tutorial serves no purpose after a first playthrough. The tutorial is designed to make a player familiar with the game mechanics. On a second playthrough, they're already going to be familiar with them. In fact, not only should the tutorial have covered every playstyle in a single go, even having the tutorial at all after a first playthrough should have been optional. You could have achieved this by giving us last chance before exiting the tutorial to change our character. In Oblivion, we had this opportunity before exiting the tutorial sewers. We could make a hard save just before leaving, and on a second playthrough or beyond, we could simply boot up that hard save, instantly create our character, and we'd be ready to face the world. For some reason, you took that out of Skyrim and it makes no sense. Maybe you didn't think it was necessary because character creation at the start was limited only by your appearance and race, but it would still have been a huge boon for subsequent playthroughs. All I can say is, thank God you brought that feature back in Fallout 4. Speaking of character creation, that transitions me to my next point. I should probably discuss in depth how Skyrim's character creation system works, because how well that system holds up will have a huge impact on my overall thesis for this video of whether Skyrim as a whole holds up in 2019. There are 10 races to choose from. That alone is absolutely huge. More races than any other RPG I have ever played, although I concede the possibility that there might be RPGs out there I haven't played that offer even more racial variety. Of course, with such a large selection of races comes the risk that the races will all feel samey. You know, the old quantity over quality fallacy. But fortunately, Skyrim doesn't fall victim to this rut. All 10 of the characters' skills feel nice and balanced. This is accomplished by the fact that there are 18 skills that each player has. Each skill can have a +5 bonus, a +10 bonus, or no bonus at all. Each race will have exactly 5 skills that have +5 bonuses and 1 skill each that has a +10 bonus. So each race starts out with 305 skill points, even if they are distributed differently. Each race also has a handful of powers and abilities that give them special boosts, but none of them feel so overpowered that all playstyles will gravitate towards that single OP power. The Breton's magical resistance is the closest you can get to a universally appealable, overpowered ability, but that's counterbalanced by the fact that they have a fairly bland greater power that they can only use once a day. The Argonians have very limited combat skills, but that is counterbalanced by their Hist Skin greater power, which effectively grants them infinite health once a day. Dark Elves have a nice balance between magic and stealth, making them good mage assassins. Imperials have a greater power that enables them to even the odds when they're outnumbered 20 to 1, as do the Wood Elves, except that it applies to creatures instead of people. Also, one huge improvement that Skyrim's racial abilities have over previous Elder Scrolls games is that you can't get them any other way besides choosing this race. The Imperials, Nords, and Wood Elves' racial powers work up to level 99, which are much more powerful than any other illusion spell in the game. Sure, you can dual cast your illusion spells, but master illusion spells can't be dual cast, and expert illusion spells only affect one enemy at a time. If you want the ability to pacify large groups of people or animals, or get large groups of enemies to turn tail and run late in the game, you'll have to choose these races, and there's simply no way around it. Sex is much more relevant in your character choice in Skyrim than it is in previous Elder Scrolls games. This is due to the speech perk Allure, which allows you to get 10% better prices when dealing with merchants of the opposite sex, and the melee damage ability Agent of Dibella, which grants 10% extra damage to any enemy of the opposite sex. We don't really select a birth sign in this game. The powers associated with birth signs in previous Elder Scrolls games have instead been reworked into standing stones, which you can swap out at any point during the playthrough. However, I am not a huge fan of the fact that you have to travel all over the game map to find all of these standing stones. I would much prefer if all the standing stones were in one location, or at the very least were easily accessible. This would have been a huge boon to swapping out playstyles on the fly, which is what Bethesda was supposedly going for when they nixed the class system. Speaking of the class system, that is my next point. The removal of the class system is one of the most controversial game design choices Bethesda made when making the game. The removal of the class system was but one step in what is arguably Bethesda's most controversial philosophy of game design, and one that's going to be coming up a lot in this retrospective: minimalism. They want to trim the fat out of the RPG system. They want to strip the game mechanics down to the absolute bare minimum necessary to actually make the game playable.
We go at it each time with, let's not just look at the last one and say, what does it need? I think most people, most fans will look at it and say, it's great, you should change the leveling, add spears, add crossbows, add this, and add some more races. And I usually approach it from, well, I want to know what skills are superfluous, that we should fold into something else to make the choice of what your character is more meaningful, make that choice more meaningful, and how are the races different? I think 10 races is enough. How is playing an orc different than playing a high elf? Or, those kind of things.
There are arguments both for and against this philosophy. On the one hand, quality over quantity is certainly a good philosophy to have when making any consumer products, not just video games. On the other hand, sometimes quantity is a quality. The various options you have for weapons, armor, races, and even skills and talents is one of the biggest aspects of any RPG. The sense of progression. As you level up, you gain access to more powerful items and abilities. There needs to be a lot of those items and abilities to choose from, otherwise leveling up will have few, if any, rewards to them. Bethesda's philosophy of streamlining and minimalism will be coming up a lot in this retrospective. However, for the time being, how do I feel about the application of this philosophy to the class system? Honestly, I would say that it was a good move. If you really take a step back and look at the matter objectively, I can't think of any good reason to have classes in an Elder Scrolls game. Classes in most RPGs have traditionally existed almost exclusively as a game mechanic, rather than existing in-universe. They exist almost purely for the sake of game balance, to keep any one player from becoming overpowered. Even in single-player only games, where you don't have to worry about other players obtaining an unfair advantage over other players, the class system is in place to prevent the player from becoming so overpowered that they can just steamroll through enemies without being strategic about their work. In games like Dragon Age, which is single player but allows up to 4 characters in the party at one time, choosing characters based on their classes and skills is important to comprising your army accordingly. The delicate game balance would be heavily undermined if you could simply choose 4 characters who are all omni-skilled. However, in the Elder Scrolls games, each player can already obtain the maximum stats in all skills and obtain the best weapons, armor, spells, and items in the game, regardless of their class. In many other RPGs, many skills and talents are class restricted. For example, in Dragon Age Origins, only mages have the ability to revive fallen companions, while only rogues have the ability to turn themselves invisible. The game is intentionally set up so that you cannot mix and match these abilities on a single character. But in the Elder Scrolls games, classes only dictate your starting position. All roads in the Elder Scrolls lead to Rome, and Rome is being an all-powerful demigod. So since your class does not serve the all-important function of keeping you from becoming overpowered by the end of the game, what exactly does the class system do? Well, in essence, it restricts what skills you will use throughout the game, and it doesn't really do much in return to balance out that restriction. So in Morrowind and Oblivion, the class system was just there. It wasn't doing anything of value. It was there simply because that's just a tradition in the RPG genre. Tradition for its own sake is not a valid reason to keep a broken or superfluous game mechanic in the game. I will have mixed feelings about Bethesda's minimalism philosophy throughout this retrospective. In some cases I will object to it, and in some cases I will defend it. This is an instance where I am doing the latter, because if you really take a step back and look at the matter objectively, you realize that the class system in the Elder Scrolls really is superfluous and unnecessary. Because Skyrim doesn't have a traditional class system, all 18 skills in the game are valid options for leveling up your character. This transitions me to my next point, the way leveling up works in the Elder Scrolls games. In most RPGs, players level up after obtaining a certain number of experience points. The most common source of experience in the vast majority of RPGs is by killing enemies. The Elder Scrolls is a novelty in the RPG genre because its leveling system actually works in the complete opposite way that most other RPGs work. You increase your skills, and those skill ups enable you to level up. You increase your skills by using them, making potions at the alchemy station, and you become more proficient at making potions. Fight enemies enough and you'll get more proficient at using your weapons of choice. Buy and sell items and you get more proficient at trading. This is one of the biggest reasons why the Elder Scrolls is one of my favorite franchises. This system of leveling up is intuitive and ingenious. It's the same way our skills increase in real life, through gradual practice. This adds an ingenious level of realism and, by proxy, immersion into the game. While it does break immersion from time to time, for example, how is it I can smith a few hundred iron daggers and suddenly and magically know how to craft Daedric weapons and armor? But that is still light years ahead of the contrivances that you can create in other games that use the experience point system. For example, in Fallout 4, how is it I can spend 6 hours building settlements in Sanctuary Hills and Red Rocket Truck Stop, and that somehow gives me the ability to create fragmentation mines and grenades? At least with the Elder Scrolls, the actions that you grind are reasonably related to the skills you're trying to acquire. Imagine if spamming the transmute spell didn't just give you lots of gold ore to work with, but actually taught you new recipes at the forge. Not even jewelry recipes, just increasing your alteration skill made you eligible for late game perks in the smithing skill tree. That would be 1,000 times more immersion breaking than Skyrim's current system. However, while I love the skills increase through use system with all my heart, it's not perfect by any means. For example, heavy and light armor skills both increase by getting hit while wearing that armor type. For starters, that's a pain in the ass. You have to put yourselves in harm's way to get armor skill ups. Practicing your skill, for lack of a better term, is very difficult for this reason. You need either high armor rating or a high health pool to be able to withstand enough hits to actually gain a level in your armor skill of choice, but you need to withstand a lot of hits to be able to increase your armor skills. It's a catch-22. Frankly, armor skills should go up just by wearing the armor and walking around in it. After all, if you read the Heavy Armor Skill Book, Orsinium and the Orcs, and I mean actually read the book, don't just pick it up, get the skill up, and put it back down again, you realize that learning how to move around in plate armor with its limited mobility is the true secret to actually using it effectively. Like the athletics skill from Morrowind and Oblivion, you can make it go up very slowly to prevent you from over-leveling this skill, leaving the other equally important skills in the dust. All in all, however, I can't stress enough how much I enjoy the Elder Scrolls system of skill increasing through use. I honestly wish more RPGs would adopt a similar system. So once we exit the tutorial dungeon, we are now free to roam the world as we please. One of the biggest draws of the Elder Scrolls franchise, Skyrim included, is the ability, once you exit the tutorial, to just pick a direction and head out and explore. This is one of the most heavily marketed aspects of the Elder Scrolls franchise, and it is also one of the ambitions for the franchise that Bethesda has realized with the greatest degree of success. After exiting Helgen Keep, you are encouraged to head to the settlement of Riverwood for supplies and rest. This makes sense in universe, and it is also heavily advised that you do so, at least on a first playthrough, as Riverwood is specifically set up to provide in-game tutorials for various non-combat related game mechanics like wood chopping, acquiring companions, and obtaining new quests. However, as highly recommended as it is that you head to Riverwood, actually doing that is 100% optional. In fact, while your Helgen companion invites you to Riverwood, he also tells you that it's best if you split up, thereby actively encouraging you to forge your own path. After you exit the tutorial, you suddenly find yourself in a 20 square mile open world, where nearly any sector of the overworld can be approached from nearly any position. With the exception of a handful of quest-related dungeons, nearly every dungeon in the overworld can be entered as early as level 1 if you manage to make the journey there. This is in stark contrast to other, supposedly non-linear games like The Legend of Zelda or Metroid, where you were encouraged to backtrack, but only because your ability to explore certain sections is blocked from you until you acquire the item or power-up needed to open the way. For example, my first Zelda game was Wind Waker. Around the bank of Outset Island, where your character grew up, there's some cracks in the wall. If you enter that cave, you actually get a cutscene that's supposed to happen about halfway through the game's main plot. However, you can't really enter that cave until you get bombs, which you don't get until about halfway through the game. The game actually railroads you into not getting bombs until the point in the story where you're meant to get them, because the only merchant in the game who sells them initially charges so much that you can't possibly afford them even if you use cheat codes to give yourself the largest rupee bag in the game and give yourself infinite rupees. Skyrim, by contrast, takes the opposite approach to open world design. You're railroaded for the tutorial quest, which takes about 30 to 60 minutes depending on how fast you go, but once you complete only that set piece, the places you can't access just yet are rarer than the places you can. Whereas Zelda and Metroid open up bits of the world piece by piece, spreading the unlocking out more or less equally across the game, and only after the final couple hours of the game have you finally unlocked everything, Skyrim unlocks 99% of the game to you almost immediately and then just tells you to dig in. The overworld itself isn't just a glorified level selector either. There are plenty of things to acquire and things to do in the overworld itself. Bandits and wolves will attack you at various intervals. Fish, flowers, and butterflies can be picked and caught for use in your potions. You can randomly encounter friendly or neutral NPCs on the road, as well as hostile ones. Also, because you are traveling the road in real time, there is always the possibility of seeing another site en route to your intended destination and deciding to put off your current objective in favor of exploring that new location. The ability to enter any section of the overworld from any direction in 360 degrees is one of the biggest things that sets the Elder Scrolls games apart from other RPGs, and Skyrim is no exception. Most other RPGs usually have tightly focused areas that the player can only enter and exit at certain points. As a comparison, let's look at the Dragon Age games. In those games, using the world map to fast travel is not optional. The different zones you can enter are not connected to each other. The only way to enter various cities or locations, such as Denerim, Orzammar, or the Dalish camp, is to select them from the world map. Like in Skyrim, you have the potential to run into random encounters, both hostile and friendly, but you don't really run into them. The character's footsteps get cut off midway through your journey, and you're just dropped into this random encounter. There is a clear, hard cut. But in The Elder Scrolls, the random encounter you get is determined before the relevant NPCs come within draw distance, making it look like they were always there. The game will load several overworld sectors around your character, as well as the sector he is currently in, and will always try to stay one step ahead of the player. This helps to create the illusion that the people you encounter randomly have always been there, and that they reach this position organically instead of just randomly popping into existence. Sure, in the game engine, they are indeed just randomly popping into existence, but with games like Dragon Age, they make no effort to hide this from the player. Skyrim maintains the illusion of an organic world, and in doing so, maintains an otherwise impossible level of immersion to suck the players in. All of this talk about exploring the overworld wouldn't really make a difference, however, if the overworld wasn't fun to explore. Thankfully, we don't have to worry about that because Skyrim has one of the most beautiful overworlds in any RPG to come along this entire decade. In the opening cutscene, where you're being hauled away to an execution, Bethesda really puts their best foot forward in showcasing their overworld design. Majestic mountains bookend both sides of the road. Beautiful mountain flowers and thistles dot the sides of the road like polka dots. During this opening cutscene, it is not uncommon to experience some fairly drastic frame rate drops, because Bethesda made sure to pack in as much overworld beauty as they could. The rest of the game doesn't disappoint either. The game's map is divided into 9 distinct holds. In-universe, these holds are political divisions, similar to counties in the real world. But from a game design standpoint, they also clearly divide up the way the overworld is drawn. There are occasional overlaps, of course, but for the most part, each hold has a distinct geography to it. For example, here are 4 images of Skyrim's overworld. One is in the hold known as The Reach, the other is in Whiterun Hold, one is in the hold of Hjal March, and the 4th one is in Falkreath Hold. If you've played this game, even casually, you can instantly tell which screenshot is which. Even on a micro level, the overworld is absolutely majestic. As I said once in a previous discussion video, head over to the Guardian Stones, stand directly behind the Mage Stone, and face due west. Using console commands to ensure that the weather is sunny and clear, wait for the clock to be at exactly 10 AM on the nose so that there is just the right glare from the sun. You will want to print that screenshot out, frame it, and hang it on your wall. Of course, the beauty of the overworld is great, but that is only one reason to explore it. In addition to the enemies to fight, people to meet, and items to acquire in the overworld, there are also plenty of stories to uncover in the overworld. I don't simply mean books that you can find laying around. Those are all in the game, and they're handled splendidly, but also the overworld itself can tell a story through the strategic placement of static objects. Here is one of my personal favorite examples of how Bethesda can do this. Notice this pair of skeletons. One of them has its leg broken in several parts. Some of those parts are inside a bear trap. There's another skeleton who appears to have died while leaning by the first skeleton's side. So clearly, one guy got his leg stuck in a bear trap, and someone else, maybe a best friend but most likely a lover, refused to leave his side and kneeled before him, weeping and comforting him until she too rotted away until only her bones remained. A tragic story of what can happen if you don't watch where you're going, and a cold reminder of just how quickly life in Tamriel can be snuffed out. Of course, it's made doubly tragic by the fact that they were only a hop, skip, and a jump away from the city of Winterhold. Knowing this, you'd think the unwounded person would have just carried her husband on her back up the hills and gotten him medical treatment. Did they not know there was a civilization just up the hill? Did the city even exist at that time? I mean, we have no way of knowing just how old these bones are, so maybe they're several centuries old. Perhaps they were running from the law and thus couldn't return to the city or else be executed, so they were just going to die anyway, so might as well die together? So tragic. Skyrim's overworld is absolutely filled with subtle stories like these. In short, the overworld has numerous reasons to explore, whether you prefer beauty, items to scavenge, or if you just enjoy a good story, like yours truly. Skyrim's overworld has rewards for all types of players to compel you to explore more. Of course, in order to explore the world, you first have to buy the game. To encourage people to buy the game, you have to make the game accessible to them. Accessibility has become somewhat of a swear word in the Elder Scrolls fandom, and the term is often synonymous with concepts like dumbing down and oversimplification. To ensure my analysis is thorough, I will analyze the game's accessibility from 4 different points of view: newcomers to the franchise, veterans to the franchise, hardcore RPG fans, and casual gamers. Newcomers to the franchise have certainly found Skyrim to be accessible to them. After all, Skyrim has sold more than 30 million copies. To put that in perspective, Morrowind and Oblivion both sold 4 million and 9.5 million copies respectively. In other words, Skyrim has sold more copies than any other game in the franchise combined. So at least a few million people who bought this game must have been newcomers, but that still begs the question, how did Bethesda achieve this level of accessibility? There are 1,000 little things that Bethesda did, maybe without even realizing it themselves, that ultimately led to Skyrim being so accessible to newcomers to the franchise. For starters, there's the very first thing you see in the game: Ralof greeting you as you wake up and smiling. As I said earlier, this certainly develops Ralof's character, but Ralof is also representing Bethesda in this cutscene. Because Ralof greets you with a smile, Bethesda is also welcoming you to the land of Skyrim with a heartwarming smile. This certainly makes newcomers to the franchise feel welcomed. It is also a subconscious feeling, and one Bethesda may not have even been aware of themselves, but it is nevertheless an extremely potent way to welcome Elder Scrolls newbies. Even after this cutscene, the way the game handles the introduction is carefully structured to ensure a maximum amount of excitement and, therefore, player investment in the game and its plot. As the player is being shoved into the chopping block, a forced camera angle forces the player to notice the headsman's axe was just about to come down just as the dragon shows up at the last minute. As you struggle to get to your feet, the screen goes blurry and there's some intentional shaky cam to add flavor to the excitement. As you head up the stairs, a scripted event happens where the dragon smashes his head through the wall, providing you with a means to escape. As you make your way through the panic, there's the occasional shaky cam to add excitement for when the dragon attacks. As you enter the Helgen Keep, the game begins the tutorial proper. If you take out the part where your choice of allies at the beginning has an effect on what items you can acquire during the tutorial, then this tutorial is otherwise a textbook example of how to do a tutorial in a video game. It starts out being fairly blatant about its nature as a tutorial. In the torture chamber, either Hadvar or Ralof, depending on who you accompanied into the keep, hands you a bunch of lockpicks and asks you to try and open the cage. They are borderline breaking the fourth wall at this point, making it exceptionally clear that this is a tutorial for how to pick locks. But at the same time, it really isn't, because they don't really teach you how to pick locks per se. They just prompt you to do so, but the actual mechanics of the locks is something you figure out entirely on your own. After that set piece, you enter a cavern where there's about 6 or 7 enemy soldiers. A couple of them are standing on an oil slick. If this is your first time playing the game and you're playing as a mage, you'll be shooting fire at your enemies. Doing so in this section will inadvertently trigger the oil slick trap. For the first time players, who don't really know that this oil is flammable, this will serve as both a pleasant surprise and a tutorial that oil slicks can be used as weapons. But it doesn't do so by breaking the fourth wall. You come across it organically, just by playing the game normally. So what about after you exit the tutorial? How does the game make itself accessible to newcomers then? Well, for starters, the autosave feature is a means of newcomers losing consequences for their rookie mistakes. Anytime you go through a load screen, and anytime you fast travel, the game autosaves. Because you can store up to 3 autosaves at one time, you've got plenty of wiggle room in case you screw up. That's certainly no excuse for you to be reckless, but it definitely has you covered in case you forget to save. Newcomers are also pointed in the direction of franchises they may wish to join by the game. On your way to Riverwood, either Hadvar or Ralof suggests you join up with their respective armies. As you enter the Riverwood Trader, the proprietor there says he sells a few spells, but tells you can get more at the College of Winterhold. As you approach White Run, you find the companions fighting a giant. Aela comes up and speaks to you, telling you about the companions and who to speak to if you wished to join. Both of these give you guidance on how to join these factions, but with the exception of the Thieves Guild, none of them shove the faction initiations down your throat. There's the invitation to join, but for 4 factions out of 5, actually joining requires the player to take the initiative. So what about veterans of the series? How is Skyrim accessible to them? Well, for starters, Skyrim boasts the traditional Elder Scrolls formula that fans of the series have come to know and love. While they have done away with quite a few favorite game mechanics, not the least of which is the ability to make custom spells, a mechanic that has been a staple of the franchise since Daggerfall, Bethesda kept enough of the formula to give returning players a sense of familiarity, but changed just enough that it didn't feel like a rehash. You still have the open world that is fun and rewarding to explore, as I've already discussed. While they replaced the Fighters and Mages guilds with the Companions and College of Winterhold respectively, the tried and true Thieves Guild and Dark Brotherhood were kept in the game. We still had the Daedra, the Aedra, and while we had new types of enemies, they were similar enough to older enemies that they still felt familiar to returning fans. For example, the Falmer were basically the new goblins from Oblivion, Skeevers were the new rats, and the Draugr were basically the replacement for zombies. Of course, it's easy to say that Bethesda kept just enough but not too much familiar. It's quite another to break down exactly what they should have kept and what needed to go. Nixing some aspects of the Elder Scrolls formula was done in the name of the aforementioned minimalist agenda, which, as I've established, is a double-edged sword. I'll be going into more detail about that throughout this analysis as I discuss where they succeeded and failed in their minimalist agenda. As for hardcore RPG fans, that's where they come up fairly short, although I use the phrase come up short in a relative sense. While many hardcore fans love and admire Skyrim, just as many scoff at the very supposed acts of dumbing down of the series. Essential NPCs, quest markers, inability to fail quests, the list goes on and on. However, if we once again take a step back and look at the matter objectively, are these things truly necessary for a game to be considered a true RPG? Let's look at a few of the other RPGs that are considered some of the best in the genre: World of Warcraft and Dragon Age. In both of those games, you can't fight people at all until the game decides you're in combat with them. You don't initiate combat with them by fighting them. The game thrusts you into combat and then you get to attack them. So killing entire cities worth of people is effectively impossible in these games. So frankly, I don't see what so many people are complaining about regarding the inability to kill quest characters. Very few RPGs give you that ability anyway. Or how about the fact that nothing you do in the game has any consequences? You can't alienate your relationships with NPCs, you can't fail quests, nothing. Again, your actions do indeed have consequences. Siding with either Faendal or Savin in their love triangle quest will permanently cause the other to refuse to deal with you. If you miss your wedding with the same person twice, that person will forever refuse to speak to you. Okay, so the consequences you suffer may not necessarily be the exact consequences you expected, and maybe they don't happen quite as often as you might like. In that case, maybe you need to get your heads out of your asses and stop acting so self-entitled. In conclusion, the game is indeed accessible to hardcore RPG fans. Rather, it's not accessible to self-entitled dickheads who expect they deserve everything to be exactly the way they want it, and that every game developer instead should adopt their development strategies to accommodate their unique tastes at the expense of everyone else's enjoyment. Unfortunately, Bethesda can't do anything to help those people. So, we've determined that this game is surprisingly accessible to franchise newbies, franchise veterans, and hardcore gamers who aren't self-entitled, though not being self-entitled is a huge condition. That leaves casual gamers as the only group that is currently unaccounted for as far as accessibility is concerned. Fortunately, this is also the easiest to establish. I have not only heard Skyrim described as a game for casuals, I have repeatedly heard Skyrim described as the game for the casuals. In fact, the arguments I just recited by so-called hardcore gamers are in fact arguments that Skyrim has been casualized compared to earlier Elder Scrolls titles. So clearly Skyrim is indeed accessible to casual gamers. This near universal accessibility is most likely one of the biggest reasons why Skyrim is the third best-selling RPG of all time. The Elder Scrolls games are, first and foremost, dungeon crawlers. The dungeons are the primary means of providing challenge to the players in the Elder Scrolls games, so how good the dungeons are in Skyrim are a huge factor in the game's overall quality. The dungeons in Skyrim are hit or miss, to put it mildly. Some aspects of the dungeons hit it out of the park, while other aspects fall so short of the bar that you have to wonder if they were even trying to clear it. As for the layout for the dungeons themselves, this is certainly a hit. The dungeons are certainly a huge improvement over Oblivion. To show you what I mean, here's a screenshot from a cave dungeon in Oblivion. This cave dungeon is required for a major Oblivion faction questline. But can any of you tell me right off the bat which dungeon this is? Or even which quest it's for? Or for that matter, even which quest line it's for? Now here's a screenshot from a cave dungeon in Skyrim that isn't even associated with any quest, let alone a major faction quest line. Despite its lack of relative importance, many of you probably instantly recognize this dungeon. One aspect of the dungeon layout that I've actually heard criticism about is their linear dungeon progression. Once in a blue moon, you'll have dungeons that have segments that you can do out of order or shortcuts you can take, but for the most part, the dungeons go from entrance to boss chambers before providing a shortcut back to the entrance or simply an exit to the opposite side of the dungeon's exterior. The shortcuts out of the dungeon were certainly a huge improvement over Oblivion's and Morrowind's dungeons, so that's definitely a point in the hit column of the dungeon designs. But as for the linearity, this is going to be a controversial call, but I'm going to say that this is also a hit. Personally, I feel the sense of exploration is at its best in the overworld, due to the multitudes of rewards you get for exploring there. The dungeons are designed to be more challenge than exploration, and so the linear nature works best. However, if it makes you feel better, I will acknowledge that the lack of variety in dungeon design is a serious miss. I frankly believe that about half, or at least a third of the dungeons should have allowed at least a little bit of non-linearity. If anything, there should have been optional branching paths, the key word being optional, that either offered extra rewards if you went off the beaten path, perhaps offered shortcuts to the dungeon boss, or maybe even offered paths that were technically just as long, but had more booby traps than enemies, or vice versa. So while I definitely approve of the linear dungeon design, although I realize that's subjective, if it's any consolation to you, I definitely believe the game should have given us more variety in dungeon design. If you're talking about the dungeon's lengths, however, I would argue that this is simultaneously a hit and a miss at the same time. If you had asked me a year ago what I thought of the dungeon's lengths, I would have definitely said that they were far too short. But then I began a blind Let's Play of Dragon Age Origins, which you can watch by clicking on the link in the description. While doing the main quest, I noticed that there were only 4 factions I needed to obtain assistance from. Obviously, they all needed favors for me to resolve their immediate conflicts before they could provide this help. However, because there were only 4 of them, the dungeons they had me going through were astronomically long. There was too much combat in the main quest and not enough story, and it was the story that got me hooked into that game in the first place. So, quite frankly, I believe the dungeons in Skyrim needed to be a bit longer, but only a bit. The next part of the dungeons that I plan to critique is its puzzles, and you get no argument from me, those are definite misses. Honestly, there isn't much I can say about these puzzles that hasn't already been said 1,000 times before, so just to sum it up, let me replay a portion from my mini-series on the Ideal Elder Scrolls 6, which you can watch by clicking on the link in the description. Anyway, here is the clip from that mini-series. Here's the biggest problem with the puzzles in Skyrim. The game literally gives you the answer in plain sight. Along with the phrase arrow in the knee, this has become one of Skyrim's most reviled aspects. Countless memes and YouTube videos have been created poking fun at how insultingly simple the puzzles are.
Man, look, the combination is on the claw.
It's not the combination.
What?
It's a trick.
It's not a trick.
They would never make it that easy.
But they did, though.
Then why make a combination at all?
I have no fucking idea.
And the best part of all this is, instead of fessing up and admitting that you screwed up, you actually tried to save face by quietly adding in a book during one of your batches that said that the puzzles were designed to keep the Draugr from escaping, rather than keeping adventurers out.
Wrong, 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 wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong. You're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong.
Ignoring for a minute that this was clearly a post-release edition, meaning it is a blatant cop-out, it is still demonstrably false. For starters, these intelligence-insulting puzzles are found in every dungeon in Skyrim, not just the Draugr ruins. Second, NPCs in the game are routinely fooled by these puzzles, and repeatedly commend you for your ability to decipher them. If the puzzles are supposed to be this easy for a living person, why is this guy right here getting killed by the poison darts when he fails? Why is this enemy soldier laying dead at this door, presumably killed by the poison darts that hit him when he couldn't figure out the claw combination? why is my commander commending me for my ability to figure this claw out, acting like I'm some sort of prodigy? And if the traps are for the Draugr, why is it, when you get the puzzle wrong, you get hit by poison darts, when the Draugr are immune to poison? If the darts are supposed to just be a means of forcing the Draugr to back away from the door, like barbed wire for cows, then why do they need to be tipped with poison which isn't going to affect the Draugr? Thus, they are clearly intended to be difficult in-universe, even if they're actually easy to an intelligence-insulting level. Third, even if we accept that these puzzles are so simple in-universe because they're designed to keep the Draugr out, it ultimately doesn't matter. At the end of the day, these dungeons exist for our amusement. At the end of the day, the bottom line is that even if there's an in-universe explanation for the puzzles being so simple, that doesn't make it good game design. And no amount of in-universe explanations, no matter how plausible they are going to exempt you from that. So yeah, the puzzles in Skyrim's dungeons are a definite miss, and there is no two ways about it. Like the overworld, the dungeons often seek to tell a story with their dungeon layout. The Draugr ruins often have hieroglyphics written on their walls that seek to describe how the ancient Nords handled their funeral and burial rites. Also, the dungeon layout themselves often give us glimpses into the story the game is telling, as well as the lore of the world. Like, for instance, in the dungeon of Dustman's Cairn, which you complete as part of the Companion's quest line, the first room of the dungeon has evidence of recent excavation, foreshadowing the fact that you're walking into an ambush. Alternatively, the dungeon of This has a section laid out showcasing how the dwarves tortured their Falmer slaves. These would be great ways for the dungeons to tell stories through their dungeon design, almost on par with the overworld storytelling that I praised so much in the section on overworld exploration. However, they fall tragically short of the mark due to one fatal flaw. Bethesda doesn't want to just let this ingenious dungeon design speak for itself, so they program your companions to spell out the dungeon layout for you like you're a little dummy.
Looks like someone's been digging here, and recently.
Even the farmer don't deserve the pain these implements must have inflicted. The dwarves were a cruel race.
This is a blatant violation of one of the most basic rules of writing. Show, don't tell. If you click on the card I provided to take you to my analysis of the ideal Elder Scrolls 6, I mentioned that rule of writing there as well. For the time being, however, suffice it to say, if you feel the need to spell out for us the way your dungeon is set up to tell a story, then by your own admission you have failed to tell the story through dungeon design alone, at which point you should go back to the drawing board. So while the use of strategically placed dungeon statics to help tell a story is a great idea and concept, I have to add it to the miss column due to its underwhelming execution. This leaves the enemies as the last thing to analyze for each dungeon. Unfortunately, I have to judge this one as a miss as well. The decor of most dungeons can usually tell you in advance what type of enemies you will encounter there. For example, these black tents and fences indicate that you will encounter Falmer, while funeral and grave materials like linen cloths and embalming tools indicate that you're in a Draugr dungeon. However, beyond the aesthetic, the enemies in the dungeons simply don't offer enough variety. And I don't mean the aesthetic of the dungeon, I mean the aesthetic of the enemies. Aside from a handful of very minor tweaks to their combat AI, nearly all enemies behave in exactly the same way. I will go into more detail about that when I talk about the game's combat system. Right now, however, suffice it to say, as far as the enemies are concerned, the dungeons rarely amount to much more than glorified palette swaps. So, in conclusion, after analyzing the dungeons in Skyrim in great detail, I have to say that, while they are indeed hit or miss, they are clearly more miss than hit. Sadly, the dungeons in this game are one of the biggest strikes against this game holding up in modern times. The cities are the last part of Skyrim's world design that I haven't yet analyzed, and since they are extremely important to Skyrim, how they hold up will have a huge impact on how Skyrim holds up. There are 9 hold capitals in the game, 10 if you include the Dragonborn DLC. Each hold is divided into 2 categories, major holds and minor holds. The capitals of major holds are enclosed inside city walls that you have to pass through a low door to enter. Minor holds don't have that, and their capitals are also much smaller than major hold capitals, being roughly on par with major hold villages like Riverwood. Speaking of their size, that's an elephant in the room I need to address. The cities in Skyrim are just too damn small. If I can fast travel to Solitude, the largest city in the game, and sprint my way to the Blue Palace, aka clear on the other side of the city from where I spawned, on only a single bar of stamina, that is just too damn small. In Whiterun, not counting Dragon's Reach Palace, there are a grand total of 21 buildings in the entire city. 3 of the 5 major hold capitals have only a single blacksmith each, with Whiterun and Markarth having a measly 2 blacksmiths, and there isn't a single hold capital in the game that has more than 1 apothecary. The Grey Quarter in Windhelm honestly feels more like a single back alley than an entire ghetto neighborhood, and if it weren't for Nazim never shutting up, I would never have guessed that Whiterun is actually divided into multiple districts. Granted, I would much rather you have cities that are smaller than normal, but still have the cities be handcrafted rather than procedurally generated, but honestly, Bethesda, you could have made your cities just a little bit bigger than that. In fact, if I didn't know any better, I would suspect that Bethesda made the cities this small just out of spite. It's like if I went into a restaurant and got a cheeseburger, asked for mustard on it, got a burger that didn't have mustard on it, asked them to make it again, and then they were like, "Oh, you want mustard? You want fucking mustard? I'll give you fucking mustard," and then proceeded to empty an entire bottle of the stuff onto the bun. That's the vibe I get when I look at the city size in Skyrim when I remember the quality over quantity argument. So yeah, this is definitely one instance where Bethesda's minimalist approach to game design works almost exclusively in the game's disfavor. Why do we need more than a single apothecary in each city? Well, sometimes immersion for its own sake is a big part of an RPG, and you just can't do that when some vendors hold monopolies on certain services without charging out the ass for their products because, you know, they have monopolies. However, one advantage that Skyrim's cities undoubtedly have over more recent titles like Witcher 3 is the political climate of each town, and how these climates actually factor into the Skyrim Civil War questline, which I will discuss in detail much later in this retrospective. Each city has unique political beliefs as well as its pros and cons. Whiterun is the first hold capital most of us are going to visit on a first playthrough. Its economy is fairly strong. As Adrian Avenici exposits, if you ask her about Whiterun, most don't go hungry if they're willing to work hard. Sure, there's the beggar Brenuin, but there's a heavy implication that he chooses not to get a job and instead just be a drunkard. The closest that Whiterun has to a major problem is the Jarl's indecisiveness about the Civil War, although that's pretty tame in comparison to the other cities. Frankly, Whiterun isn't meant to have very serious problems, it's meant to be the measuring stick for every other city in the game. At the bottom of the barrel is Morthal, the most insignificant hold capital in the entire game, and easily the second least significant city, town, or village in the game, second only to Stone Hills, which is also in the hold of Hjal March. Morthal is one of only 2 hold capitals in the game to not have a blacksmith. It has a lumber mill, an apothecary, an inn, and a magic shop, and that's honestly about it. It is also plagued with vampires both next to the city as well as living among them, a mystery we unravel through the quest Laid to Rest. The city isn't even placed on top of land that's very suited for farming. It's literally just a giant marsh where poisonous plants grow wild. As far as leaders are concerned, Morthal certainly drew the short straw on that as well. Who do you guys think is the lesser of two evils here? The woman lost in her own head, or the woman lost up her own ass? Honestly, the closest I can think of to a saving grace for this city is that because it doesn't have any major services and is located in a literal cesspool, it doesn't get a lot of attention from the war effort. Morthal is the last city the Stormcloaks attempt to take before marching on Solitude, and if Morthal is given to the Stormcloaks during Season Unending, it is the last city the Empire seeks to reclaim before marching on Windhelm. But honestly, that's like telling a person with tuberculosis, well, at least nobody will ever get up in your personal space ever again. Pulling just ahead of Morthal is the city of Winterhold. This city actually has even fewer services available than Morthal does, but the one major service it offers, the College of Winterhold, is enough to save Winterhold from a complete lack of political and socioeconomic relevance. Unlike Morthal, which just drew the short straw in terms of land distribution, Winterhold used to be a proud and prosperous city, only for an act of God known as the Great Collapse to destroy most of it. The few Winterhold residents who remain blame the College of Winterhold for causing the Great Collapse, although nobody has alleged a viable motive for why the college would want to do so. Aside from the College of Winterhold, however, there's really not a whole lot going on in this city. There's an inn and a general goods store, and frankly that's about it. To my knowledge, there isn't even a single residence in the entire city except for the Jarl's Longhouse, and it's the only hold in the game where the player cannot purchase a player home or plot of land regardless of what DLCs you own. Climbing up the ladder of political and socioeconomic importance, we come to the city of Dawnstar. It is supported by its fishing and mining industries, the latter of which is extremely competitive as the two mines of the city are owned by a pair of former lovers. As far as minor holds are concerned, the pros of this city are that it has a nice diverse economy with apothecary and blacksmith vendors, the smallest hold capital to have a blacksmith vendor. As far as cons are concerned, its default Jarl is probably the most unlikable sack of trash in the entire game, Skald the Senile. At first, his grumpiness may be attributed to the fact that Dawnstar is currently suffering from chronic nightmares due to a Daedric artifact that has spiraled out of control, except that he maintains his grumpy attitude even after that quest is resolved. He is so fanatically devoted to Ulfric's cause that he can't imagine why anyone would feel differently, as evidenced by the conversation he has with his court mage. When she tries to explain to Skald that the war is of no concern to Bretons, Skald is completely dumbfounded at the very prospect of someone not seeing the obvious glory in the Stormcloak's agenda. If there was anything that would make me join the Legion, it would probably be the prospect of getting this guy out of power. The most significant of the minor holds is probably Falkreath Hold. It has major political significance because it shares a border with the province of Cyrodiil. It also has a thriving economy supported by both lumber and wild game, both of which are abundant in the forests that are so dense that Falkreath doesn't even need any city walls to protect it. Just as its main advantage is similar to Dawnstar, having a variety of industries supporting their economy, so too is its main disadvantage, a Jarl who is completely lost up his own ass. While he doesn't appear as homicidal as Skald the Senile, he still seems completely oblivious to the fact that his position of Jarl actually has any responsibilities attached to it. Riften is easily the most corrupt city in the game, and the government makes no effort to hide its own corruption. However, the private citizens of Riften are among the most generous and charitable of any city in the game, as evidenced by the fact that they are most likely to hand out coins to beggars if you stick around to overhear the conversation. Hell, even Brynjolf will give coins to beggars. Brynjolf, one of the top guys at Thieves Guild, who is primarily responsible for the mass poverty in this city in the first place. And this isn't even a case of generic dialogue options being erroneously assigned to the wrong NPC either. Remember that Brynjolf has a unique voice actor. This means that Robert Atkin Downes was in the recording booth recording dialogue for his character giving money to beggars who he probably conned out of just yesterday in-universe, in full knowledge of the irony of his character's actions. As for its leadership, Riften is ruled by a Jarl who appears at first glance to be honorable and noble. However, because of her steward's allegiance to the Thieves Guild, something you'll learn about if you conquer Riften for the Imperials, the Jarl is often manipulated by her most trusted advisors to turning a blind eye to the corruption in the city, as well as staying inside the palace to avoid her seeing the sheer misery that her people actually live in. On the other hand, conquering Riften and placing it under Imperial rule would hardly do much good for the city, as Jarl Layla will be replaced with Skyrim's version of Donald Trump, Maven Blackbriar. So we've gone from a Jarl blissfully oblivious to the corruption in the city but still having her heart in the right place, to a Jarl who is actively creating the city's biggest problems in the first place. Markarth rivals Riften in terms of corruption, with the Markarth City Guard not only turning a blind eye to the Forsworn Rebellion, but actively participating in covering up their atrocities. Jarl Igmund is apparently in on the conspiracy himself, as at the beginning of the quest Escape from Signet Mine, we learn that he ordered a life sentence for the player character with no trial whatsoever. However, if you conquer Markarth for the Stormcloaks, the new Jarl will be Thongvor Silverblood. Despite being from the Silverblood clan, who was supposedly spearheaded the Forsworn conspiracy, there's no indication that Thongvor was part of it. In fact, he swears vengeance on the Forsworn for their treason. However, if you want my opinion, and if you don't, why are you here? Thongvor is still a huge part of the problem in Markarth. As a member of the Silverblood family, he is still very much privy to the many acts of corruption committed by the Silverbloods, like the extortion of Karthwasten, as well as his brother Thonar's allegiance with the Forsworn. Now that he is in power, he has the opportunity to bring the rest of his family to justice, but he chooses not to. This means that he tacitly approves of the Silverblood's atrocities in the Reach. Now, here's an interesting piece of world building about Skyrim's cities that I doubt many of you have picked up on. With the exception of Whiterun, the other 8 cities are actually meant to be divided into pairs, and each city in a pair is meant to be an antithesis to the other city in its pair in various ways. The yin-yang pairings are as follows. First we have Windhelm and Solitude, then we have Riften and Markarth, followed by Falkreath and Dawnstar, and finally we have Morthal and Winterhold. Let's start with Windhelm and Solitude, as their yin-yang relationship is the easiest to notice. As the seats of power for their respective Civil War armies, they obviously could not be further opposed from each other on the question of whether Skyrim should secede from the Empire. They are the only 2 cities in the game to host beggars who were forced to beg due to being wounded in service of their respective armies, and both contain private citizens possessing such overly fanatical devotions to their respective armies that they aren't interested in even hearing anyone else's side of the story.
He doesn't deserve to speak!
But we haven't taken a side because it's not our fight.
Hey, maybe the reason these Greyskins don't help in the war, because they're Imperial spies.
Markarth and Riften are paired together for this yin-yang system in part because of the aforementioned corruption in both cities. Both sets of corruption are caused by a single faction that have the guards in their respective cities in their pockets. They are both home to beggars who are forced to beg because they are disabled. Markarth's beggar is forced to beg because he became crippled due to some accident, and Riften's beggar, Ida, can't get a job because she's insane. Both cities start the game with Jarls who appear at first glance to be fair and just, but who actually are part of the problem, only to be replaced with Jarls who make no effort to hide their involvement in the city's biggest woes. Morthal and Winterhold are both largely insignificant to the rest of the geopolitical climate of Skyrim, although as I mentioned earlier, Winterhold has a slight edge over Morthal due to its eponymous magic school. In both cities, switching out the Jarls will produce little if any change in the policy or improvement in the citizens' daily lives. Last but not least, the pairing of Falkreath and Dawnstar both showcase medium-sized economies supported by 2 primary industries and several minor ones, who are naturally protected from foreign aggression by their own natural environment, the thick forests of Falkreath and the frozen tundra of Dawnstar. Both start the game with Jarls who are completely lost up their own asses only to be replaced with Jarls who put their people and duties first, although you can never end any one game with both Jarls in power, as one requires siding with the Stormcloaks and one requires siding with the Imperials. and both cities have citizens living there who place a huge amount of personal importance on the concept of loyalty.
Steel's good, but loyalty's better. I'm loyal to Dengear first, and the Empire second.
The Legion taught us loyalty, and we're loyal to Dawnstar.
My analysis on the cities of Skyrim have taken up almost as much time as an entire analysis video on my channel of normal length would, but the fact that I have so much to talk about regarding the cities just goes to show how interesting and compelling they are. This is certainly a case where having 9 cities instead of just one giant city like in The Witcher 3 works in the game's favor. You can't really have these unique yin-yang pairings by comparing Novigrad and, say, White Orchard Village, because the two are so leagues apart from each other, and not just in terms of distance, that there is simply no comparison. Even games like Fallout 4, which has a pair of cities of comparable size and significance, Diamond City and Goodneighbor, you can only really do the yin-yang comparisons once because there's only 2 cities worth comparing, whereas in Skyrim you can do it 4 times. This thematic symmetry is one of the things that, in my opinion, makes Skyrim's cities and world so incredible, and is a huge point in favor of the argument that Skyrim as a whole still holds up in 2019. The cities themselves are great and all, but what's the point of the cities if there's nobody to speak to in them? The NPCs are the primary means of delivering plot and exposition in any RPG, so how well Skyrim handles its NPCs will play a huge role in how well Skyrim stands up by today's standards. As far as the generic NPCs are concerned, one advantage that Skyrim's NPCs have over modern RPGs is that each NPC, even those who aren't strictly necessary to major quests, have personalities and backstories. Many of them even have hidden backstories if you look deep enough. For example, in Whiterun, John Battleborn and Ulfina Greymane are shown to be in a hidden, forbidden romance with each other that their respective families would never approve of. There is no quest associated with this romance, it's only there if you eavesdrop and pickpocket the love letters off them. Compare that to a game like Witcher 3, where the generic NPCs in that game serve purely as population padding. Now, I should point out that I have not yet played Witcher 3, so everything I say about Witcher 3 is based purely on what I can find online. Well, the Witcher 3 wiki says that Novigrad is populated by about 30,000 residents, 99% of whom serve absolutely no purpose whatsoever. This is an argument that can be made for the cities themselves having to be so small. If the cities were bigger, Bethesda would need to create more NPCs to live in them, otherwise the lack of population density would be immersion breaking in its own right, and more NPCs means fewer NPCs who feel unique and have unique personalities. However, as I said earlier, I think Bethesda can afford to make their cities and populations just a little bit bigger without sacrificing too much in terms of handcrafted places and people. Now, as far as the unique NPCs are concerned, that is, people who serve major roles in major quests or quest lines, this is one instance where Bethesda really hits it out of the park. First, the fact that most unique NPCs have unique voice actors helps to give the unique NPCs some individuality and identity to separate them from the pack. They are also some of the few characters in the game who actually undergo character arcs, and therefore have the opportunity for change. Very rarely do these characters actually change, but the fact that they have the opportunity for change is a welcome addition to Skyrim's various storylines. Meanwhile, the most significant faction in the game that you can't join yourself, the Aldmeri Dominion, is perhaps the most interesting and politically compelling faction in the history of the Elder Scrolls franchise. Strong believers in High Elven supremacy, they tend to have their heads the farthest up their asses of anyone else in the game. Unlike the multiple races of Tamriel, which are definitively modeled after specific real-world cultures, e.g., the Nords are clearly modeled after the Vikings, the Imperials are clearly modeled after the Roman Empire, and so on and so forth. For the Aldmeri Dominion, Bethesda appears to have drawn inspiration from multiple religious or racist radical tyrants from real-world history. They are part Hitler, part Mussolini, part Stalin, part Napoleon, part Genghis Khan, and part Osama bin Laden. They are also, of course, walking embodiments of every stereotype you have ever heard of the snooty rich snob, as evidenced by their behavior at the Thalmor party during the quest of diplomatic immunity. Now, I say all that to say this. I have spent an ungodly amount of time on the city's NPCs of this game, but the primary question for this retrospective is, does the game hold up by today's standards? Well, as far as the storytelling is concerned, yes, it absolutely does hold up. Even without playing Witcher 3, and even if I eventually decide that Witcher 3's story is 1,000 times better than Skyrim's, I can definitively say that Skyrim's story holds up, simply by reason of the story being good. Now, what exactly do I mean by that? Well, good stories never die. I can pick up a story that was written literally hundreds of years ago, and if it's translated and updated into a language that I can understand, I could still enjoy that story as much as if it were written yesterday. That's why Shakespearean plays, as well as the Iliad and the Odyssey, all remain popular even to this day despite being written hundreds and even thousands of years ago. Are any of them my favorite stories? Of course not. None of them would even be in my top 100 favorite stories, but it doesn't matter. They are good stories, and good stories last forever, regardless of what stories may come afterwards. Whether Skyrim as a whole holds up by today's standards is still up for debate, but the various stories this game tells are good stories and therefore automatically continue to hold up and will continue to hold up until the end of time. However, before I end the section on NPCs, I would like to talk about something that is a game mechanic and therefore may not hold up forever: Radiant AI. Radiant AI was introduced in Oblivion as a means of creating procedurally generated scripts in-game for the AI to follow. In layman's terms, this meant that while the algorithm for dynamically creating the AI might have been hella difficult to program, once that algorithm was set up, Bethesda could simply give a handful of general parameters for the NPCs, and the algorithm would come up with various AI for pathfinding, combat, and interactions with other NPCs. NPCs would wake up in the morning, eat breakfast, leave their house, lock the front door, head to work, and travel to the local bar, or even visit another city, all before heading home to sleep for the night. In fact, Radiant AI worked so well that Bethesda actually had to tone down the Radiant AI before launching Oblivion because they were unable to create worlds massive enough and quick enough to adapt to actually keep pace with the Radiant AI they had inadvertently coded. I'll provide a link to this guy's video in the description if you're interested. His entire channel is pretty funny and he does it with minimal production value. Procedurally generated anything in video games is generally treated with an almost knee-jerk reaction by gamers. It is often considered synonymous with developers putting less effort into the game design, instead just letting the algorithm do the game design for them. This may be the reason why Bethesda marketed their new AI algorithm as Radiant AI rather than procedurally generated AI. But in this case, Radiant AI was truly revolutionary. It was crude in its earliest development, but now that it exists, the possibilities for expanding it are limitless. We could assign various personality traits to NPCs and have those personality traits become some of the factors that the algorithm will use when assigning AI to its various NPCs in order to give each NPC a unique AI to apply to it, kind of like what Oblivion did with the AI trait of responsibility. But at the moment, I'm just thinking about what Radiant AI could become. What about what we actually find in Skyrim itself? Well, Radiant AI is a double-edged sword. On the one end, it enables each NPC to have a unique schedule and life, giving them even more individuality in addition to their aforementioned personalities. On paper, this sounds like a great concept, but at the same time, this also provides a bottleneck on how many NPCs can be processed at one time. This may be a justification for the small populations in cities and, by proxy, the small city areas I complained about earlier. Having too many NPCs being processed at once would simply put way too much strain on console and PC processors, possibly even to the point of overloading them, causing permanent damage and, in extreme cases, literal explosions. I've entertained in my head the idea of only actively processing the NPCs in the load cell that the player is currently in, while anytime you head through a load door, the game would simply calculate where each NPC was supposed to be and what they were doing before placing you on the other side of the load door. Unfortunately, that wouldn't work because some NPCs are supposed to travel between load doors and even travel to other cities as part of their Radiant AI packages. However, even if new ideas can be developed to circumvent the issues of too many NPCs being processed at one time, the bottom line is that Radiant AI will always put a bottleneck on the amount of NPCs we can have. This means that, as long as the Elder Scrolls franchise keeps Radiant AI, it will never match the sheer population of cities like Novigrad and Witcher 3, even if Bethesda were otherwise willing to code individual scripts for each NPC. So that begs the question, does that make Radiant AI an obsolete concept and by proxy causes Skyrim to hold up less by today's standards than it would have held up without the Radiant AI? Well, honestly, whether you believe Radiant AI is worth the setbacks is almost completely subjective. For some, population size and density is more important than each NPC being unique. For others, they would advocate quality over quantity in nearly all things. So does Radiant AI hold up by today's standards? It's controversial, but I'm going to say yes. Radiant AI may not be your cup of tea, but it's not broken by any means. Having it separately from non-Radiant AI games like Witcher 3 and Kingdom Come Deliverance just means that it gives Skyrim a niche. Maybe someday, some other game will come along and do Radiant AI better than Bethesda does, but Radiant AI will always have a place in the gaming industry, just like how turn-based combat engines will always have a place. So yes, while controversial, I will say that Radiant AI holds up. Artifacts are important in an RPG. They simultaneously serve as one of the biggest means of leveling your character and also the primary incentive to go out and complete quests, so it is important that these artifacts and their relative usefulness within the game hold up in order for Skyrim as a whole to hold up. For this analysis, I will divide the artifacts into two categories: weapons and armor, and everything else. For weapons and armor, they are more or less a linear progression. Steel is better than iron, Dwarven is better than steel, Daedric is better than ebony, and so on and so forth. Generally speaking, this linear progression of weapons and armor is rather simplistic, but frankly, the system still holds up surprisingly well. Compare Skyrim's weapon and armor scaling system to other games of the year that have come out since then, like Witcher 3 or IGN's 2018 Game of the Year, Monster Hunter World. These all have weapon and armor systems that have linear tiers to them. Higher tier means the weapons and armor are better, period. So while this aspect of Skyrim does indeed hold up by today's standards, here's something you probably didn't expect me to say. Do the RPGs of the 2010s even hold up by 1990s standards? To show you what I mean, let's take a look at the game that I grew up with, the first video game I ever owned, and the game that made me an RPG nerd and a gaming nerd in the first place. The Super Nintendo cult classic, Super Mario RPG, Legend of the Seven Stars. In that game, despite having an incredibly simplistic battle system by today's standards, the way you equipped your character actually required a bit of planning and foresight. Each character could only wear one piece of armor and one accessory at a time. While the armor you could get was certainly a linear progression, the accessory slot provided a lot more strategy than we see in many modern-day RPGs. There were 6 status ailments you could get in the game: Scarecrow, Poison, Silence, Sleep, Mushroom, and Fear. Each had different effects, but there were accessories you could buy that made you immune to the various status ailments. However, because you could only equip one accessory at a time, you had to strategize about which accessories to wear in various dungeons. Compare that to modern RPGs, where by the late game, you're pimped out in so much enchanted armor and clothes that you're effectively invulnerable to everything all round. One set of armor for dungeon delving, and one set of clothes for crafting and selling around the city. That's quite literally it. In fact, not only do RPGs of the 2010s not hold up by the standards of the RPGs in the mid-90s, Skyrim doesn't even hold up against older games in its own franchise. Specifically, I'm referring to Daggerfall. During character creation in that game, you have the option of giving your character various advantages. However, the game's difficulty slider would actually go up, making the game more difficult to balance out your OP advantages. You can't adjust the difficulty slider manually like you could in Morrowind or Oblivion, and once you created your character, you are locked into that difficulty for the duration of the playthrough. You can bring the difficulty back down during character creation, but only by giving your character additional disadvantages to balance out the advantages. This feeling that RPG protagonists deserve to be this omnipotent demigod who can't be harmed is, in my opinion, total bollocks. It's called game balance. This is game design 101. Characters need to have limitations placed on them, otherwise the game would provide no challenge. That's why God mode has traditionally been considered a cheat code. But, comparing Skyrim only to the games that have come out since then, do Skyrim's weapons and armor hold up? Yes. Yes, they do. Sadly. But what about the artifacts and collectibles in Skyrim that aren't weapons and armor? Honestly, Skyrim has some of the most unique and interesting non-weapons or armor artifacts in any game I have ever played. There aren't as many unique artifacts in Skyrim as other RPGs, but this is certainly a case of quality over quantity. An unbreakable lockpick, a reusable soul gem, a self-refilling bottle. These are rewards that keep on giving. I can't think of any other RPG that provides such great rewards that aren't related to weapons or armor. Granted, there are some RPGs from this decade I have yet to play, but I also checked out the wikis and other guides as well. I wasn't able to find any information on games like Witcher 3 offering artifacts as rewards that aren't either weapons and armor or means to that end, such as crafting materials. Skyrim's artifacts, however, are not means to an end, but ends to themselves. Getting the Skeleton Key is itself something that people join the Thieves Guild exclusively for. People actively seek out the Shrine of Azura for the sole purpose of obtaining the Black Star. So, do the quality of non-weapons and non-armor artifacts actually hold up by modern standards? Without hesitation, I can absolutely say that yes, they absolutely do. Stealth in RPGs is very difficult to get right. Because RPGs tend to place a lot more emphasis on character skill than on player skill, stealth does not normally mix well with that system. In the 2000s, stealth in most RPGs was entirely RNG focused. You would activate stealth mode and take on a ghost-like appearance. NPCs were then scripted to ignore your actions unless they passed a mental resistance check, which was entirely outside of your control. That is not fun, and it's often frustrating when things don't go the player's way just because some RNG rather than their skill. Stealth as a major gameplay mechanic was popularized by the Splinter Cell games of the 2000s. In those games, protagonist Sam Fisher had to stay out of the light, move slowly, avoid obstacles like broken glass that would make sounds when he stepped on them, and avoid using his gun. You dealt with enemies by sneaking up behind them and grabbing them from behind, and memorizing enemy movement patterns was critical to finding opportunities to sneak up behind them. You were highly encouraged to take out enemies one at a time, since you were normally ill-equipped to handle multiple foes. If enemies traveled in groups and you were unable to find moments when they separated, you were instead encouraged to bypass them altogether. There was no shame in avoiding fights in those games. Because you didn't level up in those games, your character skill couldn't play a factor in your success, so player skill was the only thing that mattered. Sure, there were gadgets you could unlock that would make an easier time, but you still had to take things slow and pay attention. Starting with Oblivion, however, the Elder Scrolls series juggled the delicate balance between player and character skill almost effortlessly. Light levels and line of sight factor into the player's sneaking ability just as much as his sneak skill. The speed at which he moves, combined with the weight of his clothes, factor in how much noise he makes. While the characters and enemies' respective sneak skills are certainly a factor, I mean, if it wasn't, there would be no point in even having a sneak skill in the first place as a separate skill. sneaking still feels much more in the player's control than in the hands of RNG. Because of this, it feels infinitely more satisfying to sneak up on or sneak past an enemy. But this isn't an Oblivion retrospective, it's a Skyrim retrospective. So what about Skyrim's stealth system? Honestly, that's one of the places where this game falls flat. The basic mechanics are still there from Oblivion, but Skyrim's execution falls short of the bar due to two fatal flaws. The first fatal flaw is that there aren't enough opportunities to be stealthy while playing the Thieves Guild questline. A questline that supposedly revolves around stealth. I can recall exactly one moment when being sneaky actually came in handy, and that was right here at Golden Glow Estates. This mercenary was sitting at a table with his back to me. Clearly Bethesda wanted me to sneak past him, which I did. That's honestly about it. Most other opportunities to be stealthy are few and far between, and are usually broken up by segments where you are simply forced to come into the light because there's no means of staying in the shadows. The second fatal flaw is that it is too easy to obtain gear that completely bypasses the various factors I mentioned a moment ago that make stealth such an engaging experience. Muffle enchantments are ubiquitous in the game, which completely negate one of the biggest factors that makes stealth a player skill-based rather than character skill-based game mechanic: noise from movement. When you don't have to worry about making too much noise from your movement, stealth becomes egregiously unbalanced. What's worse, custom muffle enchantments always eliminate 100% of your movement noise, regardless of your enchanting skill or the strength of the soul gem being used. Now, maybe that was an oversight on Bethesda's part, but if it was, it's an oversight Bethesda still has not patched up all these years later. So if it wasn't intentional at first, it has become such. In 2018, Kingdom Come Deliverance was released, and it has a much better stealth system than Skyrim does. Instead of just enchanting whatever boots you want with Muffle, you instead have to wear clothes that complement a stealthy lifestyle, aka those that have dark colors. Of course, this can be circumvented in the early game simply by not wearing any clothes at all and just becoming the Naked Bandit, but at least then, your movement noise isn't completely negated, which alone puts it above Skyrim's stealth system. If you're playing as a stealthy character, you're also probably playing a criminal character as well. Stealing, lockpicking, and pickpocketing are the primary actions you're going to be performing while you're on your stealthy crime sprees. Honestly, however, these mechanics don't hold up really well either. Stealing is, well, it just is. You enter sneak mode, you make sure you're not seen, and, you take some stuff. It's mechanically no different than looting in a dungeon, except that you have to make sure nobody is seeing you before you do it. It's quite frankly a very simple mechanic, but in its defense, I can't think of another RPG that does this system much better, nor can I even think of a hypothetical way it could be handled better. So at the very least, I have to say that it holds up. Pickpocketing is just boring. It's basically the same interface as taking stuff out of a container or looting a corpse. The only difference is that whether you successfully acquire the item or not is dependent on your pickpocket skill and an RNG. The only way to manipulate the pickpocket system in your favor is to quick save just before you enter the victim's inventory and loading the save if you fail. But that's not engaging. That's the equivalent of using save states to win at gambling minigames. There's nothing remotely engaging, fulfilling, or rewarding about this system. This is another instance where Kingdom Come Deliverance blows Skyrim out of the water. It begins the same way. You talk to a person while crouched, so instead of initiating dialogue, you pull up their inventory. But instead of simply selecting the item from their inventory and then saying a Hail Mary, you actually have to pull the item out of their pockets in a system similar to the old board game Operation. For regulars on my channel, you may recall me suggesting this very system during my series on the ideal Elder Scrolls 6. Well, after playing Kingdom Come Deliverance, I can personally attest that this system is ideal for pickpocketing. Now, if only everything else about Kingdom Come Deliverance was any good, the game might have been a masterpiece and a bona fide Skyrim killer. Lockpicking is atrocious. Oblivion's lockpicking minigame held up just fine. I don't see why Bethesda felt the need to overhaul the system for Skyrim. Basically, you're searching for a sweet spot in the lock. However, where the sweet spot is located is entirely random. Especially on Expert and Master locks, you can very easily break a totally fresh lockpick so fast, you don't even have time to take your thumb off the analog stick. Think about it this way, if you were playing a platformer, and obstacles appeared on screen as fast as you can break your lockpicks in Skyrim, that platformer would be almost universally criticized for its unfair difficulty. A moment ago I mentioned how Skyrim's skeleton key is often the primary reason people join the Thieves Guild. Well, the reason the skeleton key is so universally sought after is because Skyrim's lockpicking minigame is a pain in the ass. That is the complete opposite of how quest rewards should feel. Once again, I have to give the nod to Kingdom Come Deliverance for coming up with a better mechanic for picking locks. Sure, your tendency to break lockpicks is influenced by the character's skill, but a player with enough skill of his own can make it entirely unnecessary. First, when you enter the lockpicking interface, the sweet spot is randomly determined, but hovering your lockpick over the sweet spot will cause it to turn gold. However, as you begin to turn the lock with the other thumbstick, the sweet spot moves, forcing you to adjust the lockpick's position on the fly. While a higher lockpick skill will reduce the penalty you get for going out of bounds, whether you even go out of bounds in the first place is still entirely in the player's control, even if getting the hang of the mechanic might take a little practice. This is a hard one for me. It really is, because the incredible stealth system in Oblivion is the main reason I got into the Elder Scrolls games in the first place. Before I got Oblivion, I was a huge fan of the Splinter Cell games, so when I first got Oblivion, stealth was my primary build focus for at least my first dozen playthroughs of that game. I joined the Thieves Guild and Dark Brotherhood because those were the factions geared towards stealthy players. Because I initially exposed myself to the best and funnest two faction quest lines in not only that game, but the entire franchise, I fell head over heels in love with this franchise almost overnight, and I've been hooked ever since. I have since discovered a lot more of this franchise to love, so I no longer need the great stealth to continue my love for this franchise, but I really wanted stealth to be a winner here. I really wanted to say that the stealth system in Skyrim still holds up. But alas, I have to look at the matter objectively. And looking at it with as little personal bias as possible, I have no choice but to acknowledge that no, it does not hold up. Here's hoping that Elder Scrolls 6 can have a stealth system that makes Elder Scrolls the undisputed king of stealthy RPGs once again. At its core, Skyrim is a dungeon crawler. The quests almost always send you to dungeons, and there are plenty of dungeons that you are encouraged to explore independently. But these dungeons need enemies in order to pose a challenge. I mean, it's either that or challenging puzzles, and Skyrim does not do that very well at all, for reasons I already discussed in depth. Combat can be divided into 3 different categories: melee, archery, and destruction magic. Stealth can augment both melee and archery-based combat using what's known as sneak attacks to deal massive opening damage and sometimes one-hit your opponents. Meanwhile, you can also attach potions, which you can create using the alchemy skill, to your melee and archery weapons to serve as one-time buffs to your weapons' attacks. Archery is honestly the easiest to pin down. You fire an arrow, and it shoots its target. There's honestly very little to say about it other than that. I would definitely argue that archery takes more player skill than in other more recent games like Witcher 3 or Dark Souls because you actually have to aim your bow. Other RPGs have lock-on, which takes out all the aiming that comes with using archery as a combat skill. While the lock-on ability might be a welcome addition to melee combat, a system I'll go into more detail about momentarily, I'll definitely believe that it feels out of place in archery, seeing as knowing where to point your weapon is the whole point of that skill. Melee combat is honestly the biggest lost opportunity in Skyrim as far as combat is concerned. There's no way to sugarcoat it. Melee combat in Skyrim sucks. Okay, I could go into a great amount of detail about what sucks about Skyrim's melee combat system, but somebody has already done a bang-up job of describing the flaws in the system already. Regulars of my channel might remember Mr. Caption. In one of my earliest analysis videos, I included clips from his analysis of Fallout 4, and my response to those clips became the basis for that video. Well, I'd like to play a segment from another one of his videos, this time a review of Skyrim, where he succinctly explains why Skyrim's combat system is so terrible.
Now, personally, I have a bad feeling in my gut that Skyrim's list of bad guys may not be all that up to snuff, partially because I've already done all the research. But for the sake of the audience, let's do what we did for Fallout 4 and list out all of the enemies in Skyrim, and compare it to a few other games from around Skyrim's time. Note that we won't be counting alternate versions of a single enemy as a new entry. So, for example, polar bears and bears just count as one bear enemy, and all 800 versions of Drogar only count as one as well. Alright, let's start. We have bandits, forsworn, ghosts, warlocks, and or other associated mage bandit types, whatever you want to call them, afflicted, vampires, Drogar, bears, chorus, wolves, saber-cats, skeevers, mudcrabs, ice wraiths, porkers, werewolves, trolls, giants, mammoths, dragon priests, dwarven spheres, spiders, and golems, falmer, spiders, skeletons, hag ravens, shades, spriggans, wisps, daedra, firestorm and ice atronachs, slaughterfish, I guess, and dragons, of course. Okay, now let's see here. That's 36 enemies if my count's not off. Not bad, Skyrim. At least it is for now while we omit all of the little details. Now let's peer into the list of enemies provided by another open-world dungeon-crawling action RPG from around Skyrim's time that features dragons as a major antagonist. Dragon's Dogma. Dragon's Dogma has Chimera, Garm, Wyrms, Wyverns, Ogres, Cyclopses, Cockatrice, Hydra, Griffins, Skeletons, Harpies, Gargoyles, Evil Eyes, Nameless Men, Phantoms, Dragons of various sorts, Saurians, Liches, Goblins, Golems, members of the Salvation, which is a cult, Drakes, Wolves, Zombies, Bandits, which includes various types of bandits like bandit mages, and that comes out to a total of 25 enemies after filtering out any enemies that have an at least sort of similar function to other enemies. Now you might be asking, Caption, you just said Skyrim has more enemies. What's the problem here? The problem here is that not all enemies are created equal, and this is very much a case of quantity over quality. Let me ask you, what's the difference between fighting a common Drogar and a bandit in terms of strategy? They're both normal human enemies whose primary methods of threatening the player are either swing a sword at them or to shoot arrows. Which is also the same tactics that skeletons use, and also happens to be the same attacks Forsworn can employ, which also happens to be what Dremora do, and is also what ghosts kill people with. Hell, vampires and afflicted are the same way if you take off their one extra spell in that like spit attack. Oh, and in the vampire's case, it's literally just a spell that makes your health bar go down, so it's not like you can prevent it or anything. And let's not forget the Falmer. I think you get the point. Skyrim's pool of enemies suffers from multiple problems having to do with repetition and a lack of different strategies among enemies that belong to the same category. Not only does Skyrim have like 4 reskin versions of many enemies due to the game's level scaling nature, but like we've already established, many enemies function in the same way regardless of being different enemy types. Different enemy types said with some air quotes, by the way. Oftentimes the differences between enemies are either negligible or so minor that they don't even shake up how the player deals with the new enemy, or it doesn't even make enough of a difference to be noted in the first place. Let's go back to our example of Draugr and bandits. The difference between a level 1 bandit and a level 1 Draugr is that Draugr are immune to poison, and have a 50% resistance to frost magic, which is something many bandits can also have depending on which race they spawn as. That doesn't change how you deal with them, all it means is that you just may as well not apply your poisons. You're still just going to run up and hit it until it dies, or of course die to it if your numbers aren't big enough. The AI itself is also unchanged. The Drogar and bandits both run up with their weapon and attack you and maybe block on occasion or do a strong attack. It's not like bandits make use of extra tools like bombs or something, or Drogar make use of the fact that they're dead to do anything special. Nothing of the sort. They're the same damn thing, just as they were with the Forsworn and all those other enemies we listed above, except for maybe vampires, because they occasionally bring something back to life to help them. Just for comparison's sake, let me compare a basic undead in Dragon's Dogma to just the fighter class bandits, mind yourself that there are 3 other classes of bandit who all have their own unique weapons and fighting styles, to each other. The basic zombies in Dragon's Dogma have 2 attacks. They can slap at the player, or whatever else, with their gross uncut nail things to deal physical damage, and have a grapple attack where they stun the target and bite them until they break themselves free. Multiple zombies can join in on the grapple and pile onto the damage that this attack does. Unlike bandits, zombies are most commonly found at night and are especially immune to damage when they're getting up, and are especially vulnerable to fire, holy, and topor attacks since they shamble very slowly, and making them any slower may as well just stun them. 'Cause they're zombies. Sometimes they even outright crawl on the ground to get to the player. They try to swarm the player as well as they can. Their AI is a little bit mindless, 'cause they're zombies, though oftentimes the only players they're going to be able to outswarm are people who are melee attackers, 'cause they're slow, like zombies. In comparison, bandit fighters are the tankiest of their kind, employing either a sword and board, sword and shield for those of you who don't know what that means, or a 2-handed weapon. Bandit fighters can have up to 7 different special attacks that they actually share with the player's pool if you're the warrior class, though they can't use them all at once, it's dependent on their equipment. They do, however, always spawn being able to use the Onslaught and Impale abilities, which allow them to, respectfully, perform the warrior's basic 3-attack combo, perform a strong stabbing attack that can knock back small targets. And in addition to that, they may of course also spawn with another or multiple other special attacks from the remaining 5 leftover special moves that they can perform. Fighters also have a special charged up heavy attack that can devastate a target's health bar, sometimes outright one-shotting whatever they're aiming it at, but are easy to block or dodge. Bandits, unlike zombies, go about combat with some hesitation, mostly because if they all attacked in a huge swarm it'd probably be a little bit difficult to dodge or block properly. But the important part is that they're not slow, they don't just swarm the player as much, and they have totally different techniques to the zombies. And mind you, this is just the fighter bandit, there's 4 classes total. Bandit packs can spawn with fighters, warriors, striders, and mages, all of which have different tactics to one another. And that's not even bringing up the part about Skyrim's combat, where every single creature in the game does battle by running at each other and slapping their opponent with their weapon or spamming magic and arrows until something dies, which is just one of the deep-rooted flaws of the way this engine handles combat melee.
Long story short, Skyrim's melee combat system has practically no strategy to it. Honestly, the reason so many Skyrim fans eventually gravitate to a stealthy archer isn't because it's the most powerful. Most forms of combat in Skyrim can 2-shot most enemies if you're a high enough level. Most people gravitate to a stealthy archer playstyle because it combines 2 playstyles that actually require the player to pay attention and be skillful with their actions, the aiming of archery and the situational awareness of stealth. This is the most popular playstyle because it's one of the few playstyles in the late game that isn't super boring. There are actually several games to have come out since Skyrim that have combat systems that can dance circles around Skyrim. Witcher 3, the entire Dark Souls trilogy, Kingdom Come Deliverance, hell, even Bethesda themselves have made combat engines that dance circles around Skyrim in recent years with the release of Fallout 4. Honestly, melee combat not only doesn't hold up by today's standards, but it doesn't even hold up by 2011 standards. Dragon's Dogma, as Mr. Caption points out in the clip I played for you, has a combat system that is leagues better than Skyrim and came out in the same year as Skyrim. Does Skyrim's melee combat system hold up by today's standards? No, with a capital N. Last but not least, we have Destruction Magic. If you're a mage, Destruction Magic is going to be your primary means of dealing damage against other enemies. Unfortunately, Destruction Magic on its own is simply not a viable option, simply due to balance issues. The spells you need to cast are way too expensive, and you simply don't have a large enough magicka pool. Potions to restore your magicka are a pain in the butt as well, since ingredients to make them are hard to come by. Red Mountain Flower is all over the place, but you need at least one other ingredient to make a potion with, so in a majority of cases you're going to be waiting patiently for your magicka to recharge on its own, all while being completely helpless. seeing as you need Magicka to deliver both offensive and defensive spells, running around like a jackass is your only means of staying alive whenever you're out of Magicka. Now, some of you Skyrim fanboys right now are probably thinking, well, you can just get some enchanted armor that'll reduce the cost of your spells and even eliminate them altogether, so your complaint is invalid. By the way, I can call you guys Skyrim fanboys because I am a Skyrim fanboy myself. I have inward privilege. I'm looking at the game objectively, but I definitely love this game to death. Anyway, that just highlights another aspect of Skyrim's combat engine that I have to complain about. Just as Oblivion had scaled its enemies on the assumption that the player was consistently obtaining +5/+5/+5 attribute bonuses with each level up, causing the enemies to become too powerful for you after about level 10 unless you're doing efficient leveling, Skyrim's combat engine likewise seems to be balanced around the assumption that the player is going to be making maximum use of their crafting skills. Daedric and dragon weapons and armor are not impossible to find in dungeon loot, but they are extremely rare. They were super rare in Morrowind, but at least they weren't random drops, so despite being so rare, you could get them pretty early in the game if you already knew where to go and what to do. In Skyrim, if you want the best weapons and armor in the game, smithing is the only reliable way of obtaining them. This wouldn't have been much of a problem if playing the game at later levels with inferior gear was a viable option. But the enemies just take way too many hits to go down unless you're maximizing your gear. Also, the game is balanced on the assumption that you're going to be tempering your weapons and armor before actually using them, and then putting enchantments on them. The game is simply unbalanced if you're not doing those things, and it's way too easy at higher levels if you are doing those things. Smithing was a huge addition in Skyrim, but it's one that should have been optional. Instead, like efficient leveling in Oblivion, it's a mechanic that's touted as optional for a min-maxing playstyle, but is in fact mandatory just to keep pace with the rest of the game. Has anyone ever actually made a serious bid to play Skyrim at lower levels and not using smithing in any capacity? Just use the ebony weapons you loot off the Draugr without tempering them, and use only the armor that you can find as loot. Fights take forever, and since melee combat is boring, the fights feel a lot longer than they actually are. Hell, maybe the fights aren't difficult per se, but they are certainly monotonous, and using smithing and enchanting is the only viable means of making them mercifully short. If it weren't for the crafting system, fights in Skyrim would be absolutely unbearable. Now, if it's any consolation, I personally find that the crafting systems in Skyrim, taken in a vacuum, to be perfectly serviceable. The feeling of heading to a mine, digging up ore, smelting them into ingots, and forging those ingots into your own handmade weapons gives your newly crafted gear a sense of personal touch to them. Even if, as far as the game engine is concerned, these items are the exact same items that you can find out in dungeons, I still get the feeling that these items are my baby because I made them myself, rather than finding them. The problem here isn't that the smithing skill isn't fun or rewarding. The problem is that it's mandatory when it should be optional. That without it, combat is boring, unbalanced, and takes forever. And even with it, combat is still boring, just mercifully short. So, does Skyrim's combat hold up by today's standards? Hell no. So what about the game's aesthetic presentation? Does that hold up? Well, there are two aspects to a game's aesthetic presentation: the graphics and the audio. For a game that came out in 2011, the graphics hold up surprisingly well. Frankly, we're rapidly approaching an era where advancements in graphics technology is producing diminishing returns in terms of the improved visuals that we can actually see with our analog eyes. In 2016, Bethesda released a remake for Skyrim known as Skyrim Special Edition. The primary aim of this re-release was to bring Skyrim to the next generation of consoles and, in the process, give console gamers, for the first time ever, the power to mod their games. Yeah, we'll get to that near the end of the retrospective. However, while these special editions certainly requires quite a bit more graphical horsepower than the 2011 release does, I have to ask, does that increased GPU requirement actually translate into better visuals? To show you what I mean, let's look at some side-by-side comparisons between the original Skyrim and Special Edition. Here's one, here's another one, here's a third. Honestly, I can't tell much difference. The Special Edition certainly has some increased levels of glare from the sun, but as far as looking more realistic is concerned, the differences are negligible at best. The increased glare from the sun comes off more like an artistic choice by the graphics team, rather than a genuine leap forward in making the graphics more realistic. Compare that to the graphical leap that Oblivion made compared to Morrowind, or the leap that Morrowind made compared to Daggerfall. The difference is night and day. As I said a moment ago, we're rapidly approaching a point where graphics are being bottlenecked by the human eye's ability to distinguish an increase in graphics. I remember something that the at-the-time president of Nintendo, the late Satoru Iwata, said at one of the 2005 Game Developers Conferences. He was defending Nintendo's at-the-time new and controversial corporate agenda of innovating new ways for the player to interact with the game, like the newly released Nintendo DS and the in-development Nintendo Wii, rather than focus on increasing graphical and processing power of their consoles. In defense of this controversial policy, Iwata said the following.
Someday our games won't look any better. What will we do then?
If we aren't already knee-deep into that era right now, that era is certainly just around the corner. So do Skyrim's graphics still hold up? Yes, I would say they do. But what about the game's audio presentation? Unlike the graphics, the technical ability to present audio reached its plateau long ago. For the entirety of the 21st century, audio presentation has been exclusively artistic rather than technical. On one hand, it makes the question of whether the audio presentation holding up an entirely subjective one. On the other hand, just like with the section regarding Skyrim's stories, it saves me from having to compare Skyrim to other RPGs. Audio quality can be divided into three major categories: music, sound effects, and voice acting. As for music, Skyrim certainly has one Oblivion of an edge on its competition, because its music is composed by a master composer, Jeremy Soule. Soule's talent for video game music knows no bounds. In addition to the songs he writes being objectively good, they have a distinct advantage over most other video game soundtracks. They are emotionally neutral. Whatever you're feeling as you boot up the game, Skyrim's soundtrack will somehow make you feel more of that. Had a bad day at work and need a catharsis killing bandits? Soule's soundtrack will make it that much more satisfying to chop someone's head off. Just got out of a really terrible breakup? Soule's soundtrack will make you even sadder that you'll never see her again. Just got back from an intense workout? Soule's soundtrack will help you relax. Without the slightest hint of hesitation, I could safely say that Skyrim's music holds up splendidly. The sound effects are a little bit tougher of a nut to crack. They don't have Jeremy Soule's master hand behind them, but fortunately I would opine that they are certainly adequate for what they set out to do. However, I wish to re-emphasize what I said a moment ago, that this is all subjective. That just leaves voice acting. Skyrim boasts an all-star voice cast. Nearly every NPC who is important to a major questline has a unique voice actor. But what about the generic NPCs? You know, the guys who aren't part of quests or are part of minor quests? They usually share a small pool of generic voice actors. However, the voice actors Bethesda selected for them are so skilled at what they do that even though they technically have the same voice, you honestly don't notice it unless you're paying really close attention, because the voice talent Bethesda hired for this game is so damn good that they're able to convey completely different personalities with their voices just by carefully controlling the tone and inflections in their voice. To show you what I mean, here's a series of voice clips from generic voice actors in Skyrim. There are 7 different clips across 3 different voice actors, 1 male and 2 female. Despite not seeing any visuals on screen, I think the majority of you can instantly tell which characters these people are just by the way their lines are delivered. Are you ready? Okay, here we go.
Has the whole city lost their brains? I've been scrying and auguring to find the murderer myself. this isn't over. I catch you sending one letter to General Tullius. I'll have you both executed.
As my Thane, I'm sworn to your service. I'll guard you and all you own with my life. Splendid! There's a house available right now.
It was difficult at first. The Nords of this city are at best suspicious of outsiders. In fact, I once took a seaside stroll on a moonlit night and discovered a unicorn, which I proceeded to stab in the throat with a crochet needle.
It is clear that Bethesda spared no expense with their audio presentation. With an all-star voice cast, a serviceable selection of sound effects, and a score composed by one of the greatest video game music composers to ever walk the face of the earth, Skyrim is an audio masterpiece. With every fiber of my being, I can safely give Skyrim's audio the holds up by today's standards seal of approval. A massive world is great and all, but RPGs are boring if there's nothing to do in the games other than just run around like a jackass and raid whatever dungeons you come across. Fortunately, Skyrim boasts a massive quest log with literally hundreds of hours of quest content. Counting Radiant quests only once each, Skyrim boasts an astonishing 453 different quests that can be completed. By contrast, a comprehensive list of quests from Witcher 3 suggests that the game has only 358 quests to complete. That is certainly an impressive number, but Skyrim still has Witcher 3 beat. However, that's only a case of quantity. What about the quality of the quests? I have actually heard Skyrim's quests be criticized as heavily boring and repetitive. I would like to play another segment for you from Mr. Caption's Skyrim analysis.
You know what sounds more interesting than talking about a quest where we go get a thing? Talking about all of the quests where we coincidentally go and get a lot of things. I do not understand the appeal of these quests. Of all the quests I've played, and I tried to play a lot of them, I found myself doing a lot of either walking into a dungeon or fetching a thing, and oftentimes a combination of those two. The amount of fetch quests in Skyrim is insane, and oftentimes quests that should in no way be either just a dungeon crawl or a fetch quest are. Like, for example, this Dawnbreaker sword thing. It makes zombies explode. F***ing awesome. How do I get it? You run through a dungeon. You run through a dungeon and you kill a guy at the end who has a bunch of pet ghosts. And he also turns into a ghost, which is really nothing more than him getting a second health bar. Not kidding. Okay, what about this Azora's Star thing? It's apparently a soul gem that allows for an infinite number of souls to pass through it. A massively useful tool for enchanters. Where do I get that? Dungeon. F***ing surprise, am I right? And that's not to mention all the other quests. For example, right now, right in Whiterun, I can remember at least 3 quests where I had to just go somewhere, get a thing, or a person in one case, and come back, and that was the quest. I tried specifically finding cool quests by asking people on Twitter where to look, and honest to God, the only answer I actually got was quest mods. Mods.
However, I would have to respectfully disagree. As far as gameplay is concerned, Skyrim may have a formula to it for better or worse, but this formula is merely a skeletal structure that is fleshed out with the individual twists and events of each quest. To show you what I mean, let's take a look at one of my personal favorite side quests, Mistwatch, which begins when you approach the fort of the same name. A Nord named Krister believes his wife Fiola has been kidnapped by the bandits of this fort and asks you to rescue her because he has no combat skills. Why he didn't hire a few mercs before coming here is anyone's guess, but that's not the point. Anyway, you work your way through the dungeon and ultimately meet the bandit chief, who is actually Fiola herself, not kidnapped by the bandits, but having joined them willingly. Now, I will be the first to admit that the dungeon itself is nothing to write home about. It's basically just your standard Skyrim bandit dungeon crawl, but that's not the point. What makes this quest memorable is the story being told. The setup and plot twists that bookend the dungeon are the real focus of this quest. Then again, it is important for me to emphasize that this is subjective. I love a good story in my video games, and so I'll forgive a slightly dull dungeon layout if the story is good. You may feel differently about this, however, if you enjoy a good story as much as I do, there is definitely a praise I can give to the vast majority of Skyrim's side quests that is far less subjective. The branching paths. At least half the side quests in the game will offer you the opportunity to betray the original quest giver and instead side with his enemy. Promises to keep, delayed burial, the jagged crown, a lovely letter, the list goes on and on. Honestly, the only quests that don't appear to have a branching path are those that don't have any opposing parties you're trying to screw over in the first place. The blacksmith in Whiterun wants me to deliver a sword to the steward? I can't betray her, but only because there's nobody else I can resolve that quest in favor of. Isolde wants a mammoth tusk so she can convince the Khajiit traders to take her on as an apprentice? Well, unless there's only one mammoth tusk in the game and there are multiple people who want it, I don't know how you even could betray her in that quest other than just not doing the quest. Next, we have one of the most controversial additions to Skyrim, the Radiant quests. I have heard that they are merely an excuse to pad out the game indefinitely without having to actually make indefinite content. However, I wholly disagree. Once you've completed the faction quest lines, those quest lines are basically over. Yes, you can continue to do Radiant quests with those factions, but only if you choose to. Radiant quests are not required to complete the game. Radiant quests are just like survival mode in Fallout 4 and Skyrim Special Edition. They are 100% optional. You don't want them, don't do them. But what about the Radiant quests you need in order to unlock the next quest in the faction quest line? For example, the Commander's quest line is only 6 quests long, but is padded out with Radiant quests that you do in between the 6 main ones. Surely this is just padding, right? Honestly, I would still have to disagree. Well, let me clarify. I disagree with the accusation that they're padding insofar as the word padding is used in a pejorative sense. Sometimes padding is actually good, like on a bed. For example, compared to Oblivion's Mage's Guild questline, you make it to the Arcane University and you're immediately sent to acquire a Mage's Staff. The game presents this as standard for any new Arcane University recruits, but from that moment on, the questline just moves at Mach 10. It's just necromancers from now until the questline ends. We see some apprentices actually attending classes in the Arcane University's courtyard, yet here we are, the Archmage of the Arcane University, and we've never actually attended such a class ourselves. In Skyrim, most of the factions require you to complete Radiant quests in order to unlock subsequent major quests in those factions. But if we think about it, doesn't that make sense? It makes sense that we would need to do the dirty work in order to earn the trust and respect of the faction leaders who call the shots. It also makes sense that you should have to do odd jobs so the faction can continue to earn revenue, so they have the financial means to pursue whatever goals they are working towards in the actual quest lines. As for the quests being randomly generated, I quite frankly consider that to be an improvement. To show you what I mean, let's take the Oblivion's Fighters Guild quest line as an example. There's a quest in that quest line known as More Unfinished Business. In it, you visit an apothecary at the Bravil Mages Guild who needs 10 imp gold. With the exception of Maglier having jumped ship to your competition, which does advance the questline's story a small amount, this quest could very easily have just been randomly generated. Aside from Maglier's jumping ship, there's hardly any real story being told here. However, this quest is handled far worse than the equivalent quests in Skyrim because it isn't random. You always go to this specific location, always speak to this specific person who always needs specifically imp gold, and it will always be 10 samples. Overall, I approve of these sorts of dirty work quests because they add to immersion. They make the faction feel like it's having to do jobs in order to turn a profit in order to stay alive. These jobs may not be the most glamorous jobs in the world, but they add to the immersion because they're so dull. However, I much prefer Skyrim's system of randomizing these odd jobs, sending you to random locations and giving you different objectives. That helps to add to immersion in its own right. Of course, the side quests are meant to be self-contained. The faction questlines are the ones that tell the largest and, by proxy, deepest and most interesting stories. How well Skyrim handles its various faction questlines is also a huge factor in how well Skyrim on the whole holds up. The various different factions all blend together in one specific area. With the exception of the Dark Brotherhood, the other faction questlines all fall into a standard dungeon after dungeon formula, even when the questlines don't immediately appear to require it. I should warn you out the gate that I do not plan on giving in-depth analyses of any of the faction questlines in this game, as this is an in-depth analysis of Skyrim as a whole. I've already given a 3-part analysis of Skyrim's Dark Brotherhood questline if you're interested, and I may give analyses of the other faction questlines in the future, but this is merely a retrospective of how the faction questlines contribute to Skyrim holding up in the modern day, so an in-depth analysis of each faction is not needed. Anyway, the College of Winterhold questline is the one that calls the most attention to this unnecessary dungeon formula. For a faction that calls itself a college, there are surprisingly few actual classes in this questline. You start the questline by attending a single class, where the teacher shows you how to use ward spells. That's honestly about it. There aren't any classes after that. Once you learn a ward spell, he decides to put these rookie mages in unspeakable danger by having them explore a Draugr ruin while the Draugr are still walking the halls and attacking people on sight. It's clear the way this supposed field trip is set up that Bethesda felt like they couldn't afford to go more than a few minutes without giving the players some action, or else the players would lose interest like a cat distracted by a laser pointer. From there, you come across the Eye of Magnus, aka the God's Elder Scroll Reader. From there on out, classes appear to be cancelled. You don't attend a single class after that. As if that weren't bad enough, after you've resolved the immediate conflict regarding the Eye of Magnus, the Psijic Order shows up and appoints you the new Archmage of the College of Winterhold, and this makes absolutely no sense. The Psijic Order are not in any way affiliated with the College of Winterhold. What gives them the right to appoint this new Archmage? I mean, can you imagine if someone walked into a restaurant they didn't own, fired the owner, and then turned to some other guy and said, "Hey Jimmy, you're the new manager here"? Seriously, who has the balls? Slightly better than the College of Winterhold questline is the Civil War questline. Earlier, I opined that the College of Winterhold questline calls the most attention to the dungeon after dungeon formula with hardly any real story to break up the monotony. However, in my humble opinion, the Civil War questline is the worst offender of this formula. It just does a much better job of hiding the formula. Upon closer inspection, however, this questline's offenses begin to show. As far as the gameplay is concerned, it's basically just fort battle after fort battle. They do make some attempt to break up the monotony by having us do sabotage and blackmail missions, but at least half the questline are going to be fort battles. When half of any questline is composed of one specific thing, it's time to rethink the quest line. So what about the story? Well, I'm about to shock you, so put your drinks down for a minute because you're not going to believe what I'm about to say. Are you ready? Okay, here we go. The story for Skyrim's Civil War questline is practically non-existent. Wait, what? How can that be? Political intrigue and political conspiracy in this game is one of the game's most universally praised aspects. And that is true. However, here's something that you probably never really thought about until now. 99.999% of the story that the Civil War is supposed to be about is completely divorced from the Civil War questline. Yeah, think about it. Season unending, where the big players in the Civil War actually get the bulk of their character moments, that's part of the main quest. The part where the Thalmor are actually driving a wedge in between the Stormcloaks and Imperials, encouraging them to fight each other to weaken each army in the process? Yeah, we learn about that during the quest Diplomatic Immunity, which again is part of the main quest, not the Civil War quest line. The way every NPC, and especially the Jarls, feel about the war and whose side they're on? Each NPC who has the appropriate dialogue option available can be asked about their opinions regardless of whether you join either army or no army at all. I have played the Stormcloaks multiple times, and I have seen multiple playthroughs of the Imperial questline as well, and I can recall precisely one moment in both questlines when I learned something about the Civil War that I would not have learned had I not done the questline. This is when I am sent to Markarth to dig up some dirt on the steward there and blackmail him. I search his drawers and find that he's a closet Talos worshipper. However, that hardly comes as a shock if you have played the rest of the game extensively. We learn that Balgruuf Whiterun is a closet Talos worshipper if we do the Daedra quest, The Whispering Door. We learn that High King Torygg was a closet Talos worshipper if we do a mini quest line to become Thane of Solitude. Hell, even Markarth has a side quest where we dig up evidence of another closet Talos worshipper right there in Markarth. So frankly, having another closet Talos worshipper is not that big of a deal to me. It certainly is not a game changer when it comes to the Civil War questline. Now, the equivalent Imperial mission is a different story. When we dig up dirt on the Riften Steward, we don't find that she's a closet Talos worshipper. She's a Dunmer, so that wouldn't even make any sense. Instead, we find that she's actually in league with the Thieves Guild. Okay, credit where it's due, I did not see that coming. Not only that, but it actually makes a lot of sense. It offers an explanation as to how Riften can be so corrupt and crime-ridden when the Jarl, who supposedly cares about law and order, appears so blissfully unaware of the corruption happening just 10 feet outside her palace's front door. However, I would argue that this is more of a contribution to the Thieves Guild story than the Civil War. Now, some of you may think I'm nitpicking, arguing that it isn't that big of a deal that the story of the Civil War is primarily being told outside the Civil War. You, of course, have every right to feel this way. However, I don't see why we couldn't have our cake and eat it too. Once we've chosen a side, is there any reason why the storytelling had to come to a screeching halt at that point? Couldn't there have been new story developments at each new leg of the questline? For example, imagine if, at some point during the Stormcloak questline, we get the opportunity to bring some evidence to Ulfric's attention that the Imperial City had already been conquered by the Thalmor before he was tortured into giving up the information, so he's blaming himself for a problem he didn't actually cause. Imagine if Ulfric forgives himself for spilling the beans, but decides to continue the war effort nonetheless, arguing that there is more to this war than simply rectifying his betrayal of the Empire. This would have been a great character development for Ulfric. Or imagine if, upon joining the Legion, there's a quest that forces you into a trolley problem, where you're forced to choose between killing an innocent bystander and giving Ulfric the chance to escape once again. Such a moral conundrum would certainly have put the Imperial's decision at the beginning of the game to summarily execute you despite your name not being on the list in a whole new light, wouldn't it? The possibilities are endless for opportunities to tell stories and develop the characters even after you join one of the two armies. I don't know, maybe I am nitpicking, but bear in mind that the story that a quest tells is a huge factor in the quest's overall quality. I personally feel that it's only half a quest if it only tells a story for as long as you're not actually doing the quest. The Thieves Guild, Dark Brotherhood, and Companions will be analyzed simultaneously as they are similar enough in their structure that separate analyses of them for the purposes of this retrospective would result in a lot of repeating various points. As I said earlier, I've already done an in-depth analysis into the Dark Brotherhood story if you're interested. These questlines are structured much better than the Civil War questlines. For starters, they each tell stories that you have to actually join the faction to fully experience. That alone puts them above the Civil War questline structurally speaking. As far as falling into the dungeon after dungeon formula, the Dark Brotherhood, as I pointed out before, falls into this rut the least, which of course makes sense seeing as the vast majority of targets you need to eliminate can be found in urban and suburban areas. The Thieves Guild falls into this rut, but it is saved by the various Radiant jobs you can do that take place entirely within the major hold capitals. The Companions are probably the worst offender of these three for falling into the dungeon after dungeon formula, but like the Thieves Guild, the variety of raiding quests the faction offers elevates this faction above the College of Winterhold and Civil War questlines. Yes, these Radiant quests have you heading into dungeons to kill X-dungeon boss, but they also involve you rescuing kidnapped civilians, walking up to troublemaking civilians and bar brawling with them, clearing out civilians' homes that have been overrun by wild animals, and many other types of quests. Story-wise, I find it interesting, but not necessarily in a good way, that both the Dark Brotherhood and the Thieves Guild both have the plot twist of the guild's leader betraying you. That's a perfectly fine plot twist for one faction's quest line, but to do it twice in one game just feels repetitive, and it shows a lack of imagination on Bethesda's part. The companions are saved from this repetition by having a storyline that doesn't revolve around betrayal. Even the main source of the conflict, the Glenmoral Witch's gift of lycanthropy, isn't even a betrayal per se. They just didn't give all the details when they gave the gift. The companions likewise provide a fairly interesting contrast to the traditional fantasy tropes. The companions are werewolves, by the way, spoiler alert, yet they still fight for good. This is in stark contrast to traditional fantasy tropes, where those afflicted with curses such as lycanthropy and vampirism are treated as complete outcasts by society. The Elder Scrolls franchise is itself not exempt from this trope. So that leaves us with just the main quest. Honestly, forming an opinion on the main quest is a tough one. When I first played this game back in 2011, I essentially played very little except the main quest. The reviews from back in 2011 built up the dragon fights and shouts as being the most badass thing to come in gaming in years, and so I didn't really care for anything else. However, nowadays the main quest is just kind of there. One might argue that this is just an indication that the main quest doesn't hold up, but then why did I find it so compelling when I first came out? It wasn't just the advertising either. I very distinctly remember playing the main quest in 2011 and enjoying the hell out of it. So it wasn't just a case of the critics hyping up the main quest beyond its merits. Gameplay-wise, the main quest revolves around learning various dragon shouts, which grant a variety of effects. These shouts are your main reward for killing dragons, as by killing them you absorb dragon souls, which are the currency you spend to unlock dragon shouts that you learn. This system is a rather interesting one because it encourages both exploration and fighting dragons, as you need both to earn your rewards. You need to explore to discover new words of power, and you need to kill dragons to get their souls in order to unlock those words. However, I'm making this idea sound like it's executed a lot better than it actually is. That's the part I hate. See, the idea of giving you a twofold reward to encourage two aspects of gameplay is a great idea on paper, but there are several key problems with the way Skyrim actually executes that idea. As far as the words of power are concerned, the vast majority of word walls are located in either Draugr ruins or dragon mounts, and that gets repetitive pretty fast. While this certainly makes sense in lore that the word walls would only be located in those two locations, simply being lore-friendly doesn't necessarily translate to good game design. In addition to that, the dragon souls also suffer from repetition. The novelty of fighting a dragon in Skyrim was a phenomenal back in 2011, but after you kill your 500th dragon across your 10th playthrough, you start to realize the core problem. Literally every dragon fight is the same. Once the benefit of novelty wears off, the repetition of each dragon fight starts to wear on you. If you can avoid the repetition that accompanies acquiring these shouts, once you actually get them, the shouts themselves are certainly interesting. Unfortunately, the clunky interface requires you pause the game and go into a menu every time you want to change a shout. Since you only have 8 keys on the PC that you can use to hotkey your items, and on the console you're even more limited, you're probably just going to be gravitating almost exclusively to the few shouts that are most useful. Unrelenting Force, Dragon Rend, and Become Ethereal for surviving fall damage. Honestly, the game should not have given you Unrelenting Force as your first shout, because it's one of the most universally useful shouts in the game, working on nearly all enemies. By the time you have logged even 30 hours into your first playthrough, you'll be firmly entrenched into your pattern. Dragon Rend for dragons and Unrelenting Force for everything else. This problem could have been severely alleviated if there were dungeon puzzles that actually utilized other shouts, like the puzzle in Ustengrove that required the Whirlwind Sprint shout, or perhaps a puzzle that requires the Become Ethereal shout to enable you to pass through spike pits or acid pits without taking damage. The story of the main quest is heavily interwoven with Skyrim's Civil War questline, which leaves me to believe that Bethesda originally intended for the Civil War to be the main quest, or at least part of the main quest. However, the main conflict of the main quest is that the dragons are attacking indiscriminately, and everyone wants you, the Dragonborn, to put a stop to the dragon attacks so they can go back to killing each other unabated. It's basically a case of, hey, these guys are really, really good at our favorite game, so we don't want to play with them anymore because they make us feel inferior.
My cock's bigger than your cock. My cock's double the size that yours is.
So you kill your first dragon and get summoned by the Greybeards to learn how to use your shout ability for what they consider to be good. Delphine of the Blades gets in contact with you by breaking the laws of physics, both in real life and in-universe. For full details, see my list of 5 Elder Scrolls quests that make no sense. Anyway, she and you find Esbern, you find Esbern while Delphine just sits around all cozy in her inn, and the three of you decide that we need to stop Alduin from destroying the world. You now finally have an actual goal with the main quest, rather than just meandering around from one reference to the next. This is certainly a huge strike against the main quest. The first half of the main quest is honestly just you working your way through a series of contacts. You side with the guy in Helgen who introduces you to a relative of his in Riverwood, who refers you to the Jarl of Whiterun, who then tells you about the Greybeards, who indirectly and inadvertently causes you to meet Delphine, who directs you to Riften to meet Esbern. It's only when you finally meet Esbern at the end of this breadcrumb trail that we finally get to the A-plot of this quest line. You ultimately work your way through all these contacts, and most of them ultimately prove superfluous. There are several of these contacts I just mentioned that you could remove from the quest line entirely, and it would change very little about the quest, if anything at all. For example, your Helgen companion could be the one to advise you to bring news of the dragon to the Jarl of Whiterun, completely bypassing his Riverwood contact with no impact on the main plot whatsoever. While Esbern and Delphine may be considered essential to the plot, there was no reason for them to be introduced separately. They could very easily have simply been introduced at the same time, together recruiting you as Dragonborn. Then the first half of the main quest wouldn't have felt nearly as padded as it currently feels. Granted, having Delphine and Esbern introduced at the same time would require you to cut out the diplomatic immunity quest, and therefore lose out on a lot of the political intrigue that this game is so widely praised for. But then again, Bethesda could very easily have reworked that quest into the Civil War questline. Not only would it have given that questline some much needed story after starting the questline, but from a gameplay standpoint, it would also have been a nice change of pace in a questline that is bogged down by fort battle after fort battle. Granted, I am currently speaking from a position of hindsight, but then again, isn't that what retrospectives are all about? But now that you have a main goal, if you thought the superfluous plot devices and chain of unnecessary contacts were finally over, you were dead wrong. As soon as you recruit Esbern, he helps decipher an Akaviri stone wall that says that the ancient Nords used a shout to defeat Alduin. Delphine randomly decides that this shout is one that can knock a dragon out of the sky, even though Esbern didn't say a damn thing about knocking dragons out of the sky. Rather, Joan Allen knew that this was the gameplay-related effect that the Dragon Wind shout would have, and so she had Delphine say, knock a dragon out of the sky, even though Delphine had no way of knowing that. So we go on another breadcrumb trail, working our way through another series of superfluous contacts, from the Greybeards to Paarthurnax to that Orc Librarian at the College of Winterhold to Septimus Sigmus in the northernmost border of the game map.
Padding, 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 padding.
We finally get a quest to obtain the MacGuffin that we were looking for, an Elder Scroll. That way we can go back to the point of Alduin's original defeat and learn how the Ancient Nords defeated him so we can do it again. We go there, learn the Dragonwind shout, come back, and Alduin gets away. We trap one of his minions inside Dragon's Reach, head to Sovngarde, and kill Alduin for realsies. Well, it's not entirely clear if he actually dies, but his body is certainly destroyed. Maybe he'll pull a Voldemort on us and get his body back in a future game someday. Who knows? If it sounds like I made Alduin's defeat just now seem kind of anticlimactic, that's because it is. The boss fight itself is nothing to write home about. It has a higher health pool than most other dragons, but that just means he takes maybe 1 or 2 more hits to kill. He gets a much longer and drawn-out cutscene for his death than a normal dragon, but again, it's only about 10% more epic than the death scenes for regular dragons. But the real kick in the nuts is that there's no closure to the main quest line. Your achievement is hardly even recognized by anyone except the Blades and Greybeards. More importantly, dragons continue to attack indiscriminately in cities, on the roads, all over the place. There's no real incentive to destroy Alduin because his defeat doesn't really amount to anything. Contrast that with Oblivion's main quest, where the completing of the main quest absolutely has an effect on the main conflict, because Oblivion gates will no longer be active in the game. Bethesda's decision to make it so the dragons will continue to attack after the main quest is completed was made in response to fan complaints that completing the main quest in Oblivion forever cut you off from obtaining sigil stones and Daedric alchemy ingredients. By having dragons continue to attack after the main quest is completed, the player can still obtain an infinite amount of dragon bones, dragon scales, and dragon souls. However, I feel that they went from the freezer to the frying pan in this respect. A much better, middle-of-the-line approach would have had to only dragons appear in a handful of guaranteed but respawning locations, all of which were far away from civilized society. Thus ending the main quest would have provided the benefit of ensuring that cities and quest essential NPCs were safe from being indiscriminately killed outside the player's control, but would still give us the ability to continue to farm bones, souls, and scales. In conclusion, Skyrim's main quest is poorly plotted, poorly paced, and poorly resolved. This is certainly a downside on the game as a whole, and a huge strike against the game holding up in the modern day. After you complete the main game, there are 3 DLCs to give you extra replay value. Well, more like 2.5 DLCs, or rather more like 2.1 DLCs. The Hearthfire DLC isn't even a true DLC, it's more like a microtransaction. It has horse armor beaten that it actually provides some utility, but it's so insubstantial that it doesn't really deserve any real discussion beyond this one paragraph. The first DLC to be released was Dawnguard. Basically, it's taking the one interesting thing about the companions, that those with cursed bestial existence are actually the good guys, and basically just chucks that out the window. The Dawnguard are the good guys and they're hunting vampires. Now, Isran is a pretty interesting character, also Serana is one of the most well-done companions in the entire game. She was created in direct response to fan complaints that the followers in Skyrim didn't have enough personality and individuality to them, and boy does she deliver in rectifying that problem with the vanilla game. Right out the gate, however, this questline falls flat on its face. To initiate the questline, you have to go to Fort Dawnguard and speak to Isran. He'll send you on a mission to a cave to see what the vampires there are up to. There you meet Serana, who insists you take her back to her father. When you meet Lord Harkon, then and only then does he give you the option to choose one side or the other. This setup works just fine, provided that the player character isn't already a vampire to begin with. If you are a vampire, however, Isran will still let you join the Dawnguard and complete the entire Dawnguard questline, and never once make even the slightest reference to the fact that you're the very thing the Dawnguard is dedicated to fighting against. You can't simply go straight to the Dim Hollow Crypt, rescue Serana, and join up the vampires directly. It's not even like Isran is willing to accept a vampire if they're willing to fight for the Dawnguard's cause. A big part of Isran's character arc is coming to terms with the fact that Serana isn't evil despite being a vampire. So no, Isran is simply not programmed to recognize that you're a vampire, which is just dumb. Hell, even Serana says that she expected you to be one of her, aka a vampire, so even she isn't programmed to recognize if you already are one. Beyond that, the Dawnguard questline is surprisingly interesting. While it falls into the dungeon after dungeon formula that the vanilla faction questlines fall into, it is saved by having each dungeon look and feel unique. Dim Hollow Crypt initially appears to simply be a Draugr ruin at first glance, but it quickly takes on a new aesthetic. The puzzle you have to solve to open Serana's coffin actually requires some brain work to pull off. Not a lot of brain work, but infinitely more brain work than the Dragon Claw knot puzzles that we see in nearly half the dungeons in the vanilla game. We also get a surprising amount of character development from Isran. Not a lot, but a surprising amount. What's even better is that this character development is shown to us rather than told. You actually have to be paying attention or else you very easily can miss it. When Serana first shows up at Fort Dawnguard, Isran refers to her as It, and refuses to call her by her name. However, just before Kindred Judgment, Isran wonders if Serana is prepared to commit patricide. During this conversation, however, he not only calls Serana by her name, but even refers to her as her rather than it, suggesting that he has grown to respect Serana for the sacrifices she has made for their cause. It's a level of character development and a level of subtlety that I have come to not expect from Bethesda, and I hope that this newfound skill in writing character development will bleed over into the Elder Scrolls 6. After Dawnguard, Bethesda released the Dragonborn DLC. Honestly, I wish the DLC was given a unique name rather than named it after a concept that already existed in the vanilla game, because now we are forever confused and must specify which Dragonborn we're referring to, the vanilla concept or the DLC. But aside from that blunder, the Dragonborn DLC is honestly the better of the two Skyrim DLCs. It's not Shivering Isles by a long shot, but there is definitely a lot to like about it. Taking place on the island of Solstheim, which was also the setting for Morrowind's Blood Moon expansion, this DLC could serve as a throwback to Morrowind fans. However, this is an example of a throwback done right, because you are only missing out on a few tidbits of nostalgia if you haven't played Morrowind, like yours truly. The Dragonborn DLC may reuse some background music, places, and NPC names from the Blood Moon expansion, but it is still its own standalone experience, even without the throwbacks. It also avoids the pitfalls that Dawnguard falls into when it comes to actually initiating the quest line. The quest only initiates after you train with the Greybeards. By that point, your status as the Dragonborn is publicly known, saving us from the contrivance of Isran looking into your vampire eyes and never realizing that you're a vampire. Of course, you are still free to explore Solstheim to your heart's content even before the Dragonborn main quest activates. There are new quests to complete, independently of the main quest. There are new items to acquire, new places to explore, new people to meet, and yet, none of this is actually required to play and complete vanilla Skyrim. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a lost art. Not the idea of DLC in general, but the idea that the DLC should be independent of the main game, interacting with the main game only insofar as it's needed to make the DLC feel connected to it. And most importantly, it doesn't give us anything that was cut from the main game. This is the ideal way to do DLC, ladies and gentlemen. It's an art that has sadly been lost on many game publishers in recent years. And just on that alone, I would argue that the Dragonborn DLC definitely holds up. Of course, despite all the flaws I have given about Skyrim, all the complaints I mention about where I point out that it doesn't hold up, all of that is seemingly negated by one important factor. You all know what it is. If you made it this far into this video, then you're a nerd, so I don't need to explain to you what a mod is, but their contribution to making Skyrim the household name it is today cannot be overstated. Skyrim has, hands down, the largest modding community on the internet, and by quite a large margin. Bethesda not only permits mods, but actively supports the modding community, actively providing the tools needed to make modding as quick and easy as physically possible by releasing their creation kits for free download, and even providing tutorials on their own YouTube channel for how to use them. Granted, these tutorials are pretty shallow and don't go into a tenth the potential the creation kits have, but the important thing is that Bethesda goes out of its way to support the modding community, not simply taking a passive stance and allowing modders to do their thing but at their own risk. Literally every single flaw I have discussed with Skyrim, and any you can think of yourselves, can be fixed with a mod. The modding community for the Elder Scrolls practically has its own version of Rule 34. If you can imagine it, there either is a mod for it or there eventually will be one made. Now granted, such extensive mod support is a bit of a double-edged sword. For every person who praises Bethesda for their extensive support of the modding community, there are plenty others who accuse Bethesda of simply using their mod support as a crutch. They don't need to put any effort into making the games that are good on their own merits because they expect modders to clean up whatever messes the games are on launch day. There is some new fuel to the fire added in recent months with the release of Fallout 76, a notoriously buggy MMORPG. Many of these bugs are grandfathered in from Fallout 4, only this time around, they're much worse because we don't have the simple expedient of modding the game to get rid of these bugs quickly and painlessly. However, I find that accusation to be not only inaccurate, but insultingly short-sighted. As I have demonstrated this entire retrospective, there is just as much to like about Vanilla Skyrim as there is to dislike. People need to remember that Skyrim was originally released on the Xbox 360 and PS3 before being ported over to the Xbox One and PS4. Those consoles did not have mod support at all. For 5 years, the PC version of the game was the only way you could play Skyrim with mods, and yet the game still sold like a mother effer on all 3 platforms. Skyrim is the 3rd best-selling RPG of all time, having sold 30 million copies as of the time of this recording. It would not have gotten the cult status it currently has if it was only good on PC. Besides, if the game wasn't good on its own merits, I highly doubt there would be enough people who cared enough about the game to actually have an active modding community. Bethesda's support for the modding community doesn't mean jack squat if there simply aren't enough people interested in modding the game for there to even be a modding community for them to support. This is why Super Mario World for the SNES has an active, sprawling ROM hack community, while Shaq Fu, well, doesn't. But even if we accept that Bethesda really are just using mod support as a crutch so they can half-ass the rest of the game design, I'm not entirely convinced that this necessarily translates to an unethical business practice. To show you what I mean, look at Super Mario Maker. That's a game that by its very design relies on user-submitted content. There is no game at all unless the players are designing and uploading new levels, and yet it's one of the best games on the Wii U, perhaps the only reason to continue to own a Wii U. So in conclusion, the fact that Skyrim not only has mod support, but has the largest modding community in the world is an incredible boon. It is not an excuse for releasing a crappy game, but it does cause an overall good game to come ever so closer to the impossible threshold of being perfect. How well Skyrim holds up in the modern day depends largely on how much it has influenced games that have come before it, for better or worse. Skyrim's runaway success has no doubt been a game changer in the RPG genre, and numerous games have come since then that are clearly inspired by Skyrim's scope and scale. Grand Theft Auto 3 was one of the first major players in the open-world sandbox genre of gaming. In recent years, the Assassin's Creed series has arguably made the best use of the sandbox world style by having every piece of architecture climbable like platforming obstacles. Around the time that Assassin's Creed was making its mark, RPGs were likewise gravitating towards this style. Bethesda, along with BioWare and Blizzard, developed strong role-playing portfolios of open-world sandbox RPGs. But as far as cold-to-hard sales were concerned, first-person shooters like Call of Duty, Halo, and Gears of War were still the undisputed kings of the 2010s. But in 2011, Bethesda released Skyrim, and its runaway success would result in an RPG renaissance for the gaming industry. Just as platformers ruled the 1990s and first-person shooters ruled the 2000s, RPGs appeared to be dominating the 2010s, thanks in no small part to the runaway success of Skyrim. Bethesda had been known for several years by then for its Elder Scrolls series featuring expansive fantasy worlds, and was continuing to push the boundaries of scale in RPGs with Oblivion and Fallout 3. Rather than focusing on complex narratives and interpersonal relationships like BioWare and other developers were doing, Bethesda focused on creating massive worlds that begged to be explored. Bethesda couldn't have missed the surge of popularity that open-world sandbox games were suddenly experiencing, so I have to imagine they wanted to take that new, rising trope and crank it up to 11. This style of game design not only paid off in spades for Bethesda, but actually set the bar for how 21st century RPGs should work. Developers to this day take the template that Skyrim left for them and build off of it rather than building their own games entirely from the ground up, mixing them with some of the character development, moral ambiguity, and so much more that the developers like BioWare and Obsidian have created. Put simply, Skyrim is basically the blueprint for the RPGs we play today, years later. We see evidence of this in games like The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild, whose developers have freely admitted to using Skyrim for inspiration, as is explained by this Games Cannabis article. Nintendo are usually the guys who get copied, not the ones who do the copying. Considering they set the standard for 3D platformers in much the same way that Skyrim set the standards for 21st century RPGs, they also invented the D-pad, they invented shoulder buttons. Think about how many Mario Party clones have come and gone over the years. And do I even have to explain how the PlayStation All-Stars Battle Royale is just a blatant ripoff of a famous Nintendo franchise? I mean, that game isn't even trying to hide how much of a ripoff it is. Even in the RPG genre, they invented the use of timed button presses to do extra damage based on player skill rather than character skill. So for Nintendo to freely admit to taking inspiration from another game, that is high praise indeed. As a result of this, Skyrim's legacy cannot be called into question. Regardless of how the game may hold up as a standalone game, it absolutely holds up just on legacy alone. So, now that I've analyzed Skyrim from top to bottom with a fine-toothed comb, what is the final verdict? We've discussed what holds up and what doesn't hold up, but does Skyrim on the whole still hold up? My final verdict is... yes, it does hold up. But only for a blind playthrough. Okay, hear me out. Yes, Skyrim's stories hold up because they're good stories, and good stories last forever. But that doesn't mean that being told the same story over and over again is very much fun. After I've seen a movie or read a book, I very rarely have any incentive to see that movie or read that book ever again, except to pick up on subtle clues in the story such as foreshadowing or symbolism that I didn't catch when I consumed it for the first time. There's a reason why spoilers are usually frowned upon unless they're protected by a spoiler warning. The world is also great to explore, but the word explore implies that you don't already know what you're about to find, meaning that you're only truly exploring the world on a first playthrough. Every playthrough after that is just scouring for whatever you might have missed the first time around. That leaves the gameplay, combat, and dungeons as the only thing that can hold up on subsequent playthroughs, and unfortunately I simply cannot defend those. There are plenty of RPGs out there that have much more engaging combat, ones that actually rely on player skill as much as leveling up your character. Games like Dark Souls and Witcher 3 all blow Skyrim's combat engine completely out of the water. While their dungeons may not tell a story using their dungeon layout like Skyrim does, that's just part of the storytelling aspect of the game, which, again, only holds up if you're experiencing it for the first time. Meanwhile, Kingdom Come Deliverance has a vastly superior stealth system to Skyrim, as much as it pains me to say it. However, you are absolutely free to disagree with me. I still love Skyrim to death, despite acknowledging that it doesn't hold up. Is that just my nostalgia speaking? Maybe it is. But then again, why judge me for nostalgia? If I'm having a good time and I'm not infringing on the rights of others, why should I punish myself by feeling guilty about my own enjoyment? Whether Skyrim as a whole holds up in the modern day is mostly a matter of your personal preference, not only in terms of whether each individual element holds up, but also in terms of how you prioritize each element. Some may consider dungeon layout and combat to be more important than story, and they are absolutely entitled to their opinions. Some may prioritize combat over character development, but feel that Skyrim's combat does hold up while its storytelling does not. Again, those people are 100% allowed to have their opinions. In short, While I have given my opinion about Skyrim's holding up, it is only just that, an opinion. Only you can decide if Skyrim is still worth a purchase in 2019. Although, if you haven't already purchased the game, I hope this retrospective has enabled you to make a well-informed decision about this purchase. If you have already purchased the game, I hope this retrospective has given you a lot to think about. So please remember what I said at the beginning of this retrospective about commenting. And that will do it for today's video. If you guys enjoyed this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Also check out some of the other analysis videos I have made, as well as my Let's Plays, where I take a more lighthearted approach to these games and just have a good time. In the meantime, however, I am Acer Thorn, and I will see you guys later.